order. First item, approval of the minutes.
I move for approval.
Any second?
I second
Any discussion, any comments, corrections? So all in favor of approving the minutes? Okay. Are there any members of the public with public comments? No? Okay, so the consent agenda, we've got one item, number 3, which is something we're supposed to weigh in on.
Just for clarity, can I understand the way this outline was prepared? It said consent, and the implication is everything beneath that is under consent. I doubt that's the case.
Number 9.
It is. So items 3 through 9 are on your consent agenda, and the first one,
yeah,
number
that's
3, needs a motion.
Sorry, I didn't see the report section head. That answers my question. Thank you.
You can just vote to approve or accept all of them at one time, unless you want to pull one from the agenda.
Yeah, so item number 3 is the only, I guess if you want to call it action item, all the others are information. But does anybody have any questions or want to have any discussion on any of items 3 through 9?
Okay, wait a minute, I have to see which item it is, okay? That I had. And what about yours?
That's it, I'll get that.
Which one's the mini grant? Must be 7. But yours comes first, doesn't it? Can you go something?
Go ahead, and we'll go back.
Is
Okay.
Danielle's here?
We can, okay, great.
Okay, my question is this. It is on the graphs that are attached, and in particular, I want to know what is the fact mobility management. And the reason I'm asking that is because, you know, there's not really a cost like there is with everything else, so it must have a different kind of function. And so my question is, with 92% of the money spent, what are we doing?
Okay, I'll have to check with Danielle, and hopefully she'll be here.
If you'd like to set this one aside, I can see if she's available to come down
Okay.
a little bit.
I know
Okay.
she was on her way.
Okay.
Okay, I'll wait till she comes.
I had a question on that same one. It's the last one down there, which City of Coronado, where they've spent none of the money and they're 9 months into a 24-month project and they're still in development. I'm just curious whether this is a viable project or they've found an inability to execute it for 9 months into it.
Somebody we can hold on this particular one.
Okay.
Until
Until
Well,
she comes.
when you see if Danielle can come down?
Yeah.
So you could pull item 7 and still take action on the rest of the consent agenda.
Would you like to pull item 7
Yeah,
and
let's-
take action on the rest of the consent?
Yeah,
agenda?
although I don't know if there were any other. Yeah, did you have on another item?
Agenda item 6, I just
Okay.
wanted to ask a general question. Tremendous amount of detail here, and summarizing, you know, over the years, some of the reports have improved, it's summarized it. But I guess the question I'm asking staff is, what is the expectation that we, the committee, are really doing with this huge amount of information? It goes through each project, and one's increased 5,000, one decreased 6,000. One's increased 3 million to a new total of 3.7 million. So it's the whole show just seems to be inherent in this one increase, but there's no indication where the money's coming from, where it's going to, and I'm just curious of what it is what value are we adding by reading all this and putting a stamp on it?
Well, for the RTIP amendments, for the local agencies, they're actually approved by their respective councils before they're included into the RTIP, so their councils have seen them. The role of the ITOC is to make sure that the funds are being spent correctly per the Transnet Ordinance and Board Policy 31. And then also we include that additional table that shows how the funds are being programmed based on their revenues, which is something that the ITOC has been looking at over the past few years and making sure that projects and local agencies are spending their funds appropriately.
Just using one example, so the issue of using the funds appropriately, if there is an increase that would put them over the 30%, for example, then that would kind of just trigger a flag. But we don't really get that kind of an updated look at that metric though, right?
So you want to know how much each project is increased by a percentage? Because we do include how much they're increased by in funds, and then provide the updated amount. If that's something that triggers concern on a project-by-project level, then we would have to discuss that with the respective local agencies.
I'm really responding to the question Dick raised, where if what we're approving, for example, is a $5 million increase in a project, to the extent that the project was was approved in the first place, the only question about whether the incremental $5 million is consistent with the ordinance or not is whether it would throw them out of line with regard to one of the sort of the broad guideline metrics, like, you know, not to exceed 30% for improvement as opposed to congestion, right? But when we're looking at it, we're not really seeing that. We're not seeing it in that kind of context, right?
Well, for the 70/30, we don't track that on an annual basis. That's
Right.
a program-wide
cumulative
basis, and
basis,
this,
right.
since the RTIP is just a 5-year snapshot, there's no way we can capture that on a program-wide basis for that metric. That's why we provide that additional table after every RTIP amendment. And this is where each agency stands with their programming, and they are in line with their respective revenues. So that's the one thing that the ITOP looks at, making sure that they're within their revenues of their overall programming for the 5 years.
And the role of the ITOC, if you look at the front page of item 6, it's that paragraph sort of towards the second half of the page. And in essence, you know, it's to review and comment on the programming of the Transnet funds. So usually there's other funds that are being programmed, but the role of the ITOC is to focus on the Transnet funds. And, you know, general eligibility review, there are some metrics that you are interested in that, you know, as Michelle pointed out, you know, we report sort of as a, you know, programmatic basis. And then, you know, if there's any significant cost increases, decreases, just changes in general that you would like to ask of staff regarding any of the projects, then, I mean, that's the role of the ITOC.
Yeah.
I use, again, the 2 examples are on page 5. There's many of these things that are $5,000, $6,000, and hardly worth all the paper that's printed on trying to monitor. But the group of projects for operating assistance, federal transit agencies, and the bottom line is the total program amount increases by $3.0 million, bringing the new total to $3.9 million, which my simplistic brain tells me it must have started at $900,000, and all of a sudden with these changes it's going to $3.9 million. Well, to me, that's a very significant change to a project. It became something dramatically different than it originally was. I have no clue what it is, whether it's a good thing, bad thing.
Well,
the idea that we're opining on this implies that we understand this. This is one of many, but I'm just picking that one out as a significant example. There's another one, the city of San Diego. They have several things. If you add them all together, they had an $11 million increase with no decreases. So it's a sizable chunk of money. Where did that come from?
So for the group project listing, that's actually in response to the call for projects for the section 5310 in the Transnet Senior Mini Grant Program, which you had approved at a prior meeting. And we're just programming those funds that were approved. And they do a 2-year call for projects, so it's a pretty big lump of money that gets programmed all at once from that 2-year call. And for the city of San Diego, they're actually programming all of their regional transportation congestion improvement programming funds that they've been kind of sitting on for the last couple of years, and they're now programming them because they now have projects that they can apply them to. So it is a large sum of money, but it is from the city, and they're collecting that.
They're drawing upon an unallocated pot of money.
Yep.
Correct.
Well, that was a good explanation right there. I mean, that's an example.
Yes, but I mean,
the problem is they can't write all this stuff down.
There's so many of them, but on the other hand, the idea that we're opining on this implies that we have some knowledge.
Well,
At least by the look on your face, you join me, we don't.
correct me if I'm wrong, that schedule is not the result of a screen which screens out sort of more incidental dollar amount changes, right? I mean, that's kind of a complete universe, as opposed to, for example, you're only selecting items that are changing by more than 10% or 20%.
So
So I think what you're asking is, it's all the projects that have increases or decreases that are transnet funded. It's
Right.
not just a subset based on some.
And so I think what might help, in relation to Dick's point, if it's not a overly burdensome thing to do, is perhaps it would help us in terms of dealing with just the volume of information to try to focus on things that are more significant. If it's possible to do a screen to say, you're only going to present projects that have a change of some hurdle percentage that would give us insight that those are more significant changes worthy of a little bit more attention. I don't know if others feel like that
Or
would
if
be
you're
helpful.
obligated to show us all of them, that's fine, but then you somehow segregate the big ones and establish some criteria, and then, like the one explanation, they just drew upon an unallocated pot to cover that $100 million. And likewise, where there's a big decrease, where does that money go back to the unallocated pot? But some criteria that we're only looking at a select few that the dollars are meaningful, not all the relatively
Well, if
minor
there's,
ones.
if there's like a small change on a large project, would that, you would want to see that as well, right? So it wouldn't just depend on.
Well, I guess maybe we have different individual points of view, so others might want
I
to
don't want
speak
to
to
leave
that.
projects out that some.
This is an update on the changes to the RTIP, right? So we've historically always seen updates to any of the projects in the RTIP as an information item. We're not necessarily, we don't have to opine on them or approve them. We're being updated. So for one, I guess I'd like to see the complete update, and when there's specific issues that we have questions or concern about, I think it's appropriate to ask for more information, but I'd like to see continue with the full update.
We can provide information on the percent change. Like, we have that available already, if that's something that might be helpful. So it'll give you a before and after and the percent change overall for that project. If that's something that you're looking for as well.
Yeah, that might be helpful, if nothing else, for some of us, and everybody probably looks at these things a little bit differently. Just seeing like a percent change number might help flag the ones that might be a little bit more worthy of discussion for some of us, because I didn't recognize that we're not approving these.
I think we, in other things we get really into, we do monitor how, this is a continuing, cities, agencies that are getting allocations of the transit funds are allocating funds to projects, and as projects get to new phases, they allocate funds the next phase, or that type of thing. And so we're like the city of San Diego, for example, we spend a lot of effort monitoring and observing if they're spending their allocations and things, and making sure that we do it with all, and that it's spent in appropriate pots of money is spent versus, 70-30 split and all that type of thing. We do all that separately, and this is kind of the result of that, I view, and I guess I don't know if we're making it more complicated than we need to if we start asking more of this, because we're already doing it in more detail in other things we regularly do.
Well, and that goes to Dick's point, which begs the question of, well, then why even put it in the package at all if it's
Well,
if there's no incremental information that's worthy of.
Well, it's the net result of, on a project basis, it's the actual art.
So what we could do is, bring back, for the next article amendment that we bring to you for your review, because the ITOP does have a role in terms of reviewing, for appropriateness and things like that. What we're providing right now is the dollar change. So what I would propose to the ITOP is that we continue to do that, the dollar change, but as well provide the percent change. And if it's a fairly significant change, then provide perhaps an explanation as to like what you asked for. Where's the money coming from, or where is it returning to?
I would be comfortable with that. I'm not so much interested in looking at percent changes. If it's 6,000 going to 12,000, that's 100%. Who cares? It's a dollar limit. That's the size of the dollar limit change. If there's an explanation of that.
Sure.
Well, so it could be sort of a two-tiered kind of thing. It could be a percent change over some hurdle, subject to the dollar amount being in excess of something not trivial.
This would be truly the exceptions where we weren't asking for any additional work. We don't need more work
But at the same time, still provide information on, you know, all of the projects so that, you know, you'd have an opportunity to review all of them if you want to do that.
Yeah, because I suspect in different ways we all kind of triage the package in terms of how much time we spend on each item. And, you know, again, at least I struggle with this, you know, every month. I imagine others do as well. So it just would be a way to help, you know, give us a little bit of guidance as to, you know, how to manage that triage process.
But Kai is right in reminding me that we are not opining on this. We are absorbing this for information.
No, not on this one.
We move on to,
I have
within
one.
items 1 through 9 still. Yeah.
Yes, I know. Okay. If I may, this is much simpler to understand and perhaps simpler to answer. Attach agenda item 8, please. It's just 2 pages. If you look on the second page, under cost control, it says that there is significant construction activity on several projects, one of which was the San Diego River Bridge. Now, if this is the one at the west end of 8, I drive that bridge almost every day, and I haven't seen a darn thing. Can you explain what you mean?
This is the rail bridge. This is the Losan Heavy Rail Bridge.
Thank you.
If you drive northbound on Friars and look off to your right, you'll see incredible amounts of activity.
Thank you very much.
Huge steel beams are
That's
just
all.
all
Thank you.
Take the train, Donovan, take the train.
And staff is here for item 7.
Caroline, did you have something that goes back to item 7 or something new?
It was something new, so if we have somebody here for 7, I
Yeah.
defer to 7 first.
Okay.
And I've got to find my little piece of paper. There we go.
Hi.
I think you have a question also. My question is on the FACT Mobility Management Project. And my question is this. It looks like the chart explains that over 92% of the funding has been expended, but they don't have, you know, like so much provide or something else. What, they must be doing something else. I just don't understand what they're doing.
Right, so FACT was created in response to the need was identified that all of these operators were providing transportation in silos and to foster coordination. So what FACT does is try to better utilize the capacity of all the existing, one of the things they do is better utilize the capacity of existing service providers by maintaining a database of all of these other transportation providers, those that are funded through senior mini grant, MTS and CTD, and all the service parameters of those. So when somebody is looking for transportation in San Diego County that's senior or disabled, they have mobility managers that take those calls in and then match them up with the service that is best suited to their need so that they can get transportation through, you know, the city of Oceanside or through Elder Help. So those units of service that are in there, the 66,498, those represent people that are either using their online tool to help them find a ride or that are being handled as calls to their call center for information and referral services.
So basically that would be salaries of people who are helping do this?
Yes.
And what kind of feedback have you gotten on this?
They definitely provide a lot of referrals every month, and right now what we're doing is they have this committee that they get together with all the other providers, and one of the things that they're working on is having a better feedback system to find out, you know, once they send the rider to JFS, how is JFS able to help that person? Because right now that reporting function isn't happening. But generally the feedback that we hear is good, you know, that people are getting the services that they need, but we're really trying to figure out a mechanism to better track, you know, making sure that those people are actually getting their rides once that referral happens.
Do you know how many people they actually service per month?
I don't know the number of, you're talking about like unique.
Well, you're saying that they get a lot of people who need help and call in. So my question would be, with the expenditure of this money, how many individuals are they helping by
Each month?
Yeah.
A couple hundred, but I don't know off the top of my head.
Just a minor issue on that one. You said the grant term is 10/1/16 to 9/30/17. It is broken into 2 one-year increments. Am I not understanding something there? Is that not a, I'm working my calendar right, but it's just a 1-year time span in the grant term, but you get 2 a
For the
year?
mobility management?
No, I was on this one. This is
I'm
the
sorry,
one.
I'm sorry, I'm on the one below it.
Okay.
Fact, right. Item fact.
Oh,
Is there a typo in there, or is it,
yeah, that's a 2-year grant term.
it's a 2-year program?
Mm-hmm.
Are you finished with your?
I am.
The question I had was on the last one down there, where the expense
It's
is
10/1/2015.
I'm sorry.
Just so you know, it's 10/1/2015. Where it's, the typo is where
Okay,
it says
it's a typo.
2016.
The last one down there, where they're 9 months into their 24-month program, and they're still in development, and they haven't spent any money.
Right.
Is that a viable program? I mean,
So they actually started on March 1st. So it took them, but
but you're comfortable that they're going to be able to execute whatever their original plan was? It just took them a while to get off the ground.
we'll see.
I sense your comfort. They're underway now. So
They're underway, and,
Right.
and we're closely monitoring to see how these next few months go.
It's not relevant to try to pull the plug now. They're underway. Thank you.
Caroline, you have something else?
Okay, I just wanted to ask a question of Kim, but if she's going to be here for the whole meeting, I'll wait till the last because it involves AB 805, the bill that is proposed, changing Sandag's way of doing business. We'll be here to the end. Okay. It's all yours, David.
Anything else on 1 through 9?
I have a question on number 9, I wasn't sure. This has to go back to the annual estimated tax revenue item, so I'm not sure if we're gonna go over those separately. That's, we always spend a little more time on those documents, I wasn't sure.
Well, I was going to also say on item 9, we have a pretty full agenda, but we're actually ahead of schedule. So I don't know if Lisa, you had a sort of a quick overview for us or not. Okay, you didn't? Okay.
It's never quick.
I just.
So what would you like? Would you like me to go through everything, or do you just have specific questions?
Well, I just had a question on attachment 3, and just with the new revenue and raise here, about the annual forecast versus prior year. Are these the new fiscal year 17 and all that going forward? Is the new revenue estimates? That you
For
guys,
FY17, that is the current. That's the updated board approved. This is the estimate was adjusted in February.
the
so
one
that
that
is
was adjusted
the
down,
current.
right?
Mhm.
Okay. And that's the first year, so it was 3.5% down to 2.62%. Is that what? I know the.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I had a note on my page, particularly with the controversy that unfortunately has evolved over the last several months. I'm wondering whether there'd be any value to having a left-hand column there to what was the original pre-ordinance approval estimate for each of those years. I mean, if I'm understanding this correctly, this is our actual compared to the estimate that presumably was made the year before that actual occurred?
Do you mean the original forecast that we did? You want to compare that?
Way back when there was an original forecast of how much revenue this ordinance would generate, and presumably it was broken down by year, and implicit in there had been some assumed inflation factor for each of the 40 years.
Oh, so do you want to go back all the way to the 2002?
Yeah.
Is that what you're asking? So,
2008.
That's when it
Well,
was developed.
So the forecast was developed in 2002 that was used. So it's the $14.2 billion forecast, and you'd like to see how close we are year to date and on this page. We could do that.
But you want it specifically by year, so you want the FY09 compared 10 or just year to date?
I guess I'm saying I'm not certain what all I'm learning from this. It just tells me how accurate a short-term forecast was. In other words, each one of these forecasts was done some time in the recent past, and you're tracking how things have come in. That's from a taxpayer point of view. We voted for something based on an estimate of how much money would be generated how are we doing? And I don't think I'm smart enough to get that from here.
I understand. So one of the things I think I showed at the last iTalk was the original forecast and where we currently think we're going to come in. So there was a graph that showed the 14.2 billion and it showed the recession and where we think we were going to be now. So, you know, as we update the forecast every 4 years, now we're on Series 13, it might be as relevant or more relevant to show the latest forecast in terms of what our thinking is in terms of where we're going to be. We're below where we believed we were going to be back when we did the original forecast. And so, I mean, we're not going to be catching up to that anytime soon. So I'm just wondering in terms of relevance, is it more relevant to be looking at our latest forecast says this and are we on track with our latest forecast?
If I'm hearing you correctly, you must have answered my question last meeting when I wasn't here.
No, but
I think, well, I would maybe just to add a little wrinkle, and also for clarification. So for example, are you asking that if you go back to, was it 2004 was the original time frame? When was the original?
forecast was actually done 2002.
2002. 2002.
It was used for the measure, but
Yeah,
that was used
so if you take the 2002 forecast for what would be collected in fiscal year 2012 in isolation, I'm not sure that helps me. But if you look at it from inception to date.
Cumulative
right,
to date is what I would be seeking.
Yeah, so you're looking really just for one number to be added to this chart, which is the
$400 million.
original inception to date estimate.
what did you just say?
I think, is it
actuals to date
versus the actuals to date?
So I think I presented a graph the last time that showed that we were about $400 million below where we had expected to be at this time, given the 2002 forecast. So maybe I could share that presentation with you.
But I think you're asking for on an ongoing basis, that number just be added to the chart. Because if you think about, like, you know, for example, when you do budgeting, right, the budget, the starting place is always the starting place. That doesn't change. You may have revisions to the budget, but you would typically show, here's the original budget, here's the revision, and here's the actual. And what we're really looking at is only the revision and the actual, and you've dropped off the original number, if that makes sense.
So you would like to have a column added that is the original.
Just for the inception to date.
Inception to date, okay. And then would you want one that looks at the current forecast or just the adjusted? So the two columns we have right now are the estimates and the actual. So those are both off the short-term model, right?
Right.
But the original is off the long-term demographic and economic forecasting model. So you're not really comparing apples and apples. That's why I'm just wondering, did you want the current column in there also? If we're going to go and put the original in, should we also say, but those new long-term forecasts have been revised to this amount, so that you have a basis of comparison? Because the 14 billion we don't believe is going to come in. What we're looking at now is somewhere around maybe 10 billion or so. And so, do you want to compare to that too? I guess because the 14 billion it's in $2002. I can do it. I just don't know that it's going to give you the answer that you're really looking for, since the forecast has been revised 3 times since then.
I can answer that.
Yes.
This gives us a current status on your recent forecast. Fine, very useful information. Just as sort of a memo entry, 2 numbers. One, the original forecast, cumulative to date, actual receipts, cumulative to date.
Okay.
And that'll show what you just told me I should have seen last month,
Okay.
or some X million behind, and probably not be comfortable. I would also be interested in the analysis behind that variance. And my mind wants to oversimplify with just 2 variables. One is you must have assumed, your predecessor must assume some rate of inflation.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was all these assumptions about growth, population growth, so on and so forth. What has been the principal cause of the variation? Were we off on inflation assumptions, or did we have all the principal independent variables did not materialize with the recession and so on and so forth?
Yeah, so the 14.2 billion was in 2002 dollars, so that was corrected for inflation.
Okay.
However, there were two big factors that impacted the collection. One was the Great Recession, where we had significant decreases in collections per year, and we still aren't up to where we were prior to the recession in real dollar terms. And that was on one of the graphs. And the second thing is that the population growth rates are significantly less than they were prior to the recession. Prior to the recession, we believed we would have about 4.5 million people here by 2050. That, from the California Department of Finance, that number has now been revised down to around 4 million.
Were we on track prior to the recession for that assumption?
We were on track, but then when the recession hit, now all of a sudden we have slower population growth, and it doesn't look like we're going to catch up with, or that's going to continue to increase. It looks like it's leveling off. And so what happens if you're short by 500,000 people, those people aren't going to be spending revenue in the out years. And so that brings the entire forecast down. So there were two shifts. There was one was a shift because of the recession, and the other one was this structural shift in the population forecast that we experienced. And those are the two primary drivers.
In pure theory, then, someone who's distressed about that shortfall should be comforted by the fact we have that many fewer people on the highway. So we didn't need to have all that money to enhance that.
I suppose that's one way you could look at it. So.
Can we maybe share the
Yes.
presentation if
Yes.
they can spend some
Yeah, I
time?
apologize
Yeah.
for my absence.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean,
I think that'll answer a lot of questions. Yeah.
We could, after this meeting, I could do it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think also this is really one side of the ledger, right? Because these are revenues, and also only is one small part of the revenues, not all the revenues that go to the projects. There's the project cost side. So
I get that fully. I've argued
Yes.
your brief for you in your defense to many audiences.
yeah. So I think, so part of it is, I don't know how, I think we recognize that the original forecast number is not, it was done more than a decade ago, and it's not a relevant number anymore. So I don't know if presenting just the original forecast with one part of the picture on the Transnet, but we're happy to provide.
It just helps explain the issues when some people go ape over the errors in forecasting and so forth, to put it all in perspective.
You'll love his presentation. That was good.
Okay, anything else on items 1 and 9? Okay, item number 10, Ariana.
Yes.
So, do we need to?
Oh, we need a vote. That's
We have to
right.
formally approve the, or accept. And the approval of the consent. Okay, any other discussion? All in favor?
Kramer, hi.
So your last meeting was in March, and since then the board and the Transportation Committee met both in March and in April. There were the usual presentations on the overview of financial markets. You're going to hear more about that on your agenda today. And there was also the presentation on the EMP Land Management Quarterly Update. You saw that in March as well. The Transportation Committee also received a presentation on your draft fiscal and compliance audits for fiscal year 2016, and both your chair and your auditor presented that together. And then, in addition, the Transportation Committee recommended and the board approved the funding eligibility request by the City of Lemon Grove and MTS. And staff did convey your suggestion regarding identifying and monitoring the non-cash transactions. And then there were a few follow-ups from your March meeting, and those were to provide a dollar amount of indirect costs as a % of project costs, bringing back a proposal to standardize indirect cost plan updates, and then also providing the MTS pension liability amount. And we just want you to know that we are working on that, and we haven't forgotten, and that will probably be presented as part of the agreed upon procedures for your fiscal year 2017 audit, probably at your July meeting. Then the board also approved the draft fiscal year 2018 program budget, and your agenda today is going to cover the Transnet component of that budget. I talked term limits and related amendments. You saw that in March, and the board also approved that amendment to the ordinance and your bylaws. And then the senior mini funding recommendations were approved by the board, and you received the reviewed the project evaluation results for that program back in February. And then in addition, the Transportation Committee reviewed the Plan of Finance draft assumptions, and they supported the new format of presenting those assumptions, your overview of developments in the Financial Markets later on your agenda today is going to cover the status of the schedule, the presentation of your plan of finance for the Major Corridors Program coming to one of your meetings in the near term. And then finally, at your March meeting, you also received the presentation on the data accuracy 7-point work plan. And we informed you regarding the board's action to undertake an independent examination, and the board did select a law firm, and that examination is underway. Say that again?
Which firm?
Houston.
Houston and Hennigan.
Say that again, please.
Houston and Hennigan. H-U-E-S-T-O-N and Hennigan.
How long is that anticipated to take, or?
The contract's been signed, they're currently in the document review process, they've asked for a number of, emails and documents. So they anticipate getting through that in the next week or so, and then probably going through an interview phase with staff members that they're going to identify. The original request for proposal had them making a presentation to the board in the June timeframe. So we anticipate it's perhaps June, perhaps July, depending on how subsequent phases go. I think they were looking to sort of wrap it up by the summer, at least the initial.
So relatively efficiently done, not
Right.
long
Not
drawn
for
out.
long.
Yeah.
Anything else on our analyst report? Any questions? Okay, item 11, we've got to appoint our audit subcommittee.
Yes.
Lisa?
We need to appoint the audit subcommittee. So this is for the 2017 transit compliance audits for the AEP process. And last year we started early as well, choosing in May, so that we have a little bit of time to work through the agreed upon procedures instead of 2 weeks. Working with the auditors and any additional input of the committee, coming back to the ITAC as a whole in July for acceptance, and the audit would then begin in August. So Tracy is always a default on this subcommittee. And so we're asking that,
We're not a default.
They're default. And then we're asking that we have 3 other members chosen today, and then we'll start reaching out shortly thereafter.
Lisa, on the fiscal audit, can you tell again, just refresh us on sort of what the audit's about as far as fiscal issues, and how does that relate to sort of what happened with the fund estimates and all that? Is that related?
You're talking about the SANDAG, like the CAPR, or are you talking about the compliance audit? The compliance audits? There's with...
Well, a fiscal, right? It's a fiscal audit we're doing, right?
It's not the performance audit, so it would be, yeah.
But and then as far as what we just talked about, as far as the numbers coming in, the fund estimates and all that, is that related to this?
That's not in their audit scope.
It's more compliance.
Right.
It's labeled fiscal, but it's really just compliance.
Right, so this is, for the most part, it's looking at the ordinance, and there are some board policies that we have to, specific rules within the policies that the auditor will measure in this audit. So and then of course the ITAC has some input, but it's really the use of the funds.
Okay.
As a prelude to this, does staff have any ideas or recommendations of where there's a need to change the procedures?
There usually are at least some minor changes. I haven't had that discussion with the auditor yet, because I want them to focus on finishing up on this last request of the ITAC, the indirect and other information. But what we typically start with is we ask the auditor, to discuss some of the concerns that they received from the local jurisdictions to help us better understand that maybe there's a better way of getting the information, or maybe we have to expand on something, remove a procedure, maybe there's something that's duplicated. And then, you know, we always ask the ITOC, is there anything additional that you would like to see that makes sense to put in the procedure?
I didn't know whether we had built up a laundry list waiting to be added into this new.
You know, if there is something during the year, I usually write it down. If there was a question that came up that I think, oh, that might be good to add in there. And then, you know, we discuss the merit of adding it. You know, and this year, like I said, I haven't had that discussion yet with the auditor. I was hoping to start that next week with them.
But we haven't, I don't remember us generating any items that we thought would be.
Well, two years ago, I recall there were a couple of things
Yes.
which were in fact included in the new scope, let's call it. My recollection is last year, I don't believe we had any suggested changes that came from the ITOC last year.
Right. Well, last year, I think there was an
Was there?
expansion of the indirect.
Yeah, your discussion was to the extent that cities use some of their transnet dollars to pay for indirect costs, you wanted to kind of.
Oh, right, yes, yes.
Right,
And then
right.
coming from that, the last set of audits and stuff, I think there was a leaning towards, hey, some of the folks' indirect cost rates are more up to date, others, I think it was Chula, I believe, there's a little added cost, is that something we should
Right.
test, or, you know?
Yeah, so that's one that came up just like, you know, several months ago. But I was
Right.
thinking back when we had our sort of formation of the
Uh-huh.
audit subcommittee
Right.
going back to
Right.
last June. I don't recall other.
It was,
other
yeah,
aspects.
I believe the only change was there was, it related to the indirect procedure, and I think that expanded just a little bit more to add additional information in the response, so that you could actually see more information. In previous years, I believe it was just, yes, we charge indirect, no, we don't.
And maybe this is something to outsource to the subcommittee itself, but I think it would be useful for you to kind of report out comprehensively, here was the list of things that were recommended to be added to the scope, and they, you know, just validate that in fact they have been added and that sort of thing.
Okay.
But to the business at hand, which is to select a subcommittee, I've served on the committee for the past couple of years. I'm happy to do it. I know Dick has as well. I can't recall, or John.
Two quick thoughts. Number one, in further response to Brad's question, the annual audits are the source of much of the material that's in our annual report, as opposed to the 3-year audits that discuss other things. My second question, we're losing a lovely lady, and I'm so sorry about that, I believe we are, but would it be appropriate to appoint her replacement to this group, partly for training and let him help to get used to how we operate?
Don't tell the person.
They're on board.
Oh.
You know what, may I just comment on that? I think that when you first come to one of these meetings, unless you have extensive, you know, interplay with Caltrans, Zandig, or something else, they're speaking a foreign language. And then to be put, you know, and try to be helpful for an audit, when you don't even know the rules, you don't know about, you know, the 30% rule or any of these other things, I think it would be a little frustrating for a newcomer.
I withdraw my suggestion.
Okay, so we've got one volunteer. And will you be able to, do you think? Okay. So then the
Alfred
proposed
and Ray
subcommittee would be myself, Kai, and Dick. Do we need to vote on that, or is that just?
Yes, and
That's the
Dick?
motion.
Yeah, okay, so I'll move to approve those 3 individuals for our audit subcommittee.
Second the motion.
Any other discussion? Last chance to.
Frank and actually did. Jonathan said take exception to your phraseology that we're losing. Fair enough. That term is used elsewhere with a different perspective.
My wake will be held tomorrow.
But you're losing me also at the same time, and has to be appointed, so recognize.
Well, I think, yeah, and I actually talked with Ariane about this, but, so we can comprise this committee subject to, and then if, in the unlikely event, the selection subcommittee, we end up losing, we'll adjust. So, okay, so then can we vote on that? All in favor? Okay. The next item, number 12, this is to review and potentially approve the recommendation of the triennial performance audit consultant process. And Dustin, did you want to speak to that?
Sure. I have my little cheat sheet. Thank you. So on Monday, your subcommittee met with 4 independent auditing firms to review the 2018 Trends and Trend Performance Audit that covers 2015 to 2017. Kind of rising above the rest was the Schoberg team. They demonstrated a strong level of expertise. They had some really good relative experience in California and in Arizona. I think they would be able to provide some good benchmarking for further improving the ITOC performance audits. We did discuss the perception, the need to potentially get a fresh set of eyes. You know, when it was all said and done, the Schoberg team was I think we ranked them the best qualified, but that was a concern that was brought up. That perception of just continually going back to the same firm. So in recommending the Schoberg team, I think your subcommittee feels that we can work closely with this team. We can ensure an outcome that will benefit the Transit program. So with that, I would move that the subcommittee is recommending that we work with Jenny and moving forward with negotiating with the Schoberg team. So that's our request, is that the rest of the committee approves that recommendation. And that's subject to, obviously, working out all the details through the contractual process with Jenny.
And just for information, Schoberg is the consultant that has done all of the performance audits that have been done for the history of the ITOC. So that fresh eyes concept is something that we talked about, but you all may have feelings about that as well.
I think there's real merit in fresh eyes.
I second the motion.
Who are these people? What is their name? I'm not sure.
Schoberg Eveshink.
And what is their scope of their practice? Can you summarize what they do? It's not a CPA firm, I'm taking.
No, they are, maybe you can remember, they do performance audits. Mr. Schoberg was the former, state auditor?
State auditor.
He's actually the guy that kind of wrote the rule book on how performance audits are supposed to be done in the state of California.
And his partner as well.
His partner worked
Marianne
with
Eveshink.
him at the state. They created their own firm back in 2000, I believe. So they do exactly what the performance audit needs.
Sounds like they're qualified.
Sounds like what?
Qualified.
I just wanted to make one comment. I remember after the last one, we had mentioned we wanted to make sure that somebody keeps track of what's happening with the design build projects, and you know, the big one that's going on the Interstate 5 corridor, to find out, are we spending more money, less money, the same? What is the amount of claims we get against us from contractors? So I just want to make sure that when you come to the performance, we don't forget that one important part about the design build.
Just to clarify, the North Coast corridor and Mid Coast, the construction manager, the different procurement
Yes.
process.
CMGC.
Okay.
Yes.
CMGC, okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
You're going to get a report from the 2 corridor directors, Alan Casa for the I-5 CMGC and John Haggerty for the Midcoast CMGC.
In the next couple months.
Next month, June?
Next couple months, yeah.
So
Right,
next-
but you know what I'm talking about? I'm talking about over, you know how it
Over
is.
time.
Yes, and we remember when the claims come in, don't we? It's not
I
in the
do.
beginning, usually.
And, yeah, your annual report last year, I think, included a whole section, maybe it was the year before, on the benefits and the challenges and opportunities with, you know, the various.
Right, and I think that,
delivery methods.
right, which is great. I mean, but that is before you actually experience what happens on the ground.
Yeah.
Dustin, I'm sorry I didn't make it on Monday. I did get a chance to read everything. I just, you know, I was the lead for the last performance audit with Kathy Brady, and I think they did a great job, and I was always impressed about how much money she was trying to save, and in particular when it was fun, I made a joke out of it, when she would always she'd go to McDonald's for lunch, and she would always save these receipts for, you know, they were conscious of their budget, and they did go over, and they had to eat the cost and all that. I just wonder, this would be the fourth time, right, for them? My gut feeling was that they did a great job, but it seems to me that it's sort of routine for them now. And I felt that way a little bit. I mean, I wasn't involved in the first audit, this first or second audit, but it's not negative, but it almost felt like they were just sort of going through the motions a little bit. They knew exactly what to do, and they knew all about Sandag, and sort of it was the same format. And I'm wondering, based on the other ones, maybe you could tell us who your second choice is and how that would play out if we chose to go to a new direction. Do you guys have a second, was it close enough for a second choice here, or did you feel so strongly that?
We've got some heads nodding yes, some heads nodding no.
We did have a second.
Some of me just feels like we ought to just start fresh. I mean, you have an audit being done, and all that.
Should we do it in front of them? Aren't these the representatives from the company that you were thinking about picking? If you're going to discuss choosing somebody else, do you want to do it?
They're not in there.
Oh, okay, okay.
Oh, no, this is Jenny from our contracts.
Okay, no, I didn't know. I didn't
Veronica
know.
from your transmit.
Oh, okay. I didn't know if this was the company. I'm going, what?
So was it, I forget if it was it Keith Region?
So Harvey Road.
Harvey Road,
but it
the
was
second.
very, very close.
Right, so we had 4 proposals, there's always a second, third, and fourth, because we ranked them in order, and Harvey Road is your second ranked firm.
Close?
Very close.
Mm-hmm.
Well, no, not
Close to the
close
first.
between first and second.
No. Correct.
Close between second and third.
You're recommending someone different than you experienced last time.
No, it's the same.
No, same firm.
This would be the fourth. This would be the
This
fourth.
would be their fourth.
I'm sorry.
They would be the only firm that have done the triennial audit. My knowledge is correct.
Yes.
Would it be helpful to put the rankings up on the screen if you have it, or we can do it without taking all that?
Yeah, I just was curious. I mean, I know you have a motion. I just was wondering what the real factor was to pick them again. I mean, you sort of said it, but and Tracy said it, and also.
Yeah, so there was a couple of things that stood out, I think, with Schoberg. In addition to the fact that they know our program very well, the niche that they kind of created in doing this type of work, we saw that a lot of their references were very, there was a great nexus between that, and we felt that some of the experience and the information that they might have from those clients that they're also doing similar type audit work would benefit us. I think in the other 3, we didn't see that level of experience with the same type of audits that we have. There were some that were really specialized in performance audits, but they were more focused on maybe bond financing or school construction. We had some that looked more like they were financial statement auditors, compliance auditors, with not a great deal of experience in performance. And because our program is so specialized, I think that that's kind of why Schoberg rose to the top. I don't know if you want to add to that.
That's good.
You know, I'm just wondering why we would, I mean, I understand having fresh eyes, but it's like this. Would you want to have a fresh engineer just out of college come in on your project? Let's say the one that I was just talking about with Jim, because he's got fresh eyes versus the experience and proven talent that you want when you're asking something to be done. So for me, I would want to go with your first pick because you guys were on the committee, you looked at the different people, you scored them, and I don't want to second guess you.
Well, I would, Brent's comments are valid. I don't want it to be run of the mill, we know what we're doing, very lackadaisical. I mean, I think we should put a bug in their ear that this week, keep the game up, don't settle in,
Don't just go through the motions
just go
because
through
you've
the
been there
motions.
before, right?
Right.
And they may not, I just want to reactions that this is the fourth time, so.
Yeah, no,
But I wasn't in the interview, so.
We did have a
Well,
healthy discussion on that topic.
Yeah, I guess my own perspective is that all things being equal, you'd want fresh eyes. The unfortunate thing in this case, and if you saw the rankings, you'd see there's a really big gap between first and second. So it's like all things weren't equal. And that's the essence of the problem.
And also I want to mention, we got the highest number of applications we've ever gotten when we put this procurement out. So we got 4 applications, all 4 were interviewed. And also the next performance audit, following the one, so it's an optional to carry them over for 1 or 2. And that's why they weren't always evaluated. This committee did elect that option in the prior years. And again, so after a 3-year review, you can go back and start this process new.
That's actually a great point, Frank. So is the contract written for just the 1-3-year period, or is the contract written for both engagements for the next 2 audits?
Yeah,
Or is that up to us?
It's written with both, so if we wanted to continue, we'll negotiate for both.
So it's an option.
It's an
But it's
option.
optional.
It's an option. It's an option for the ITALC. So we will come back
Do you
and we
happen
will
to
ask
know if
you.
their pricing was predicated on getting both? Or is that clearly understood from that their pricing is such that they may only have one of them?
That's right. They understand.
Okay.
They understand that they may only get this one audit, that the second one is completely optional, and that you would take another vote to hire them again or to go through another procurement process at that point in 3 years' time. And one other thing I just wanted to mention is that one of the first tasks that your performance auditor has is to develop a work plan in conjunction with you. And so that's your opportunity to say, I want you to look further into X, Y, Z. So.
Yeah, this is very helpful.
Yeah, this is great.
It's unanimous, but the spreads were significant, and the spreads were significant on essentially every evaluator, as far as I'm concerned in the discussion.
I agree. I think you guys did a great job.
Great job.
This is a very good documentation of what you did.
Yeah, and there's a lot of qualitative stuff behind it, but it illustrates it pretty well. Okay, so we're ready to vote then? So all in favor of accepting or offering a contract to Schober?
That's a 2-year, it's a 1-year contract with an option for a 2nd year.
What was their motion?
Yes, there was for Dustin
Okay,
and
so all in favor? Okay.
Thanks, Dustin.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, item number 13. Sue?
Sue Albert, I'm an Associate Project Control Analyst in the Transnet Department, and I'm here with another RTIP amendment.
We love our tip amendment.
At its May 19th, 2017 meeting, the Transportation Committee is scheduled to approve amendment number 5 to the 2016 Regional Transportation Improvement Program. The ITALC is asked to review and discuss the projects included in this proposed amendment, focusing the review on the Transnet-funded projects. Amendment number 5 to the 2016 RTIP is an administrative modification and is being processed due to time constraints and is detailed in the discussion section of your report starting on page 2. This portion details the changes for each project program with Transnet funds and, if applicable, provides the amount changed in funding. In attachment 1 of your backup, beginning on page 3, the changes proposed in this amendment specifically for those projects funded with Transnet. Each project includes Transnet funding at the top, followed by any other funding program on the project. We also show the Transnet subtotals and other subtotals to inform you of how much Transnet and other funds are being programmed. I'll just mention that, based on our previous discussion, that the primary changes in this amendment are to add active transportation program funding to several bike projects and FTA Section 5311 non-urbanized area formula funds to several of the transit operators projects. The only Transnet funded project that's really, the only transit that's impacted is the Mid-City Rapid project, and there's no change in the funding level, it's just the funding is being redistributed over the years based on project needs. Any questions? Any comments? No?
You get off easy. Okay. Veronica, the annual report.
So the ordinance requires that annual reports be provided by the ITOC to the Sandbank Board of Directors. The annual report includes information on the status of major corridor projects, overall program performance, and compliance requirements within the ordinance. So today we are showing you the proposed draft of the 2017 ITOC annual report. It begins with a proposed executive summary to be signed by the ITOC chair. So that's a new thing that we added this year. And on page 2, it follows with a comprehensive list of the key ITOC activities and recommendations made during the current fiscal year from July 1st, 2016 to June 30th, 2017. And which of those activities support the overall financial integrity and performance of the program. So a couple of the major responsibilities of ITOC have always been including the annual fiscal and compliance audits and the triennial performance audit. So we made sure that the draft report captures both. There's a summary of results of the recent annual audit. Then we also describe some of the ongoing efforts to implement the recommendations from the prior performance triennial audit. And then we also included a statement there about the upcoming fourth triennial audit. So the new section included for proposal in this year's report on page 10 is going to be Sandbank's ongoing efforts to strengthen the transparency, accountability, and accuracy of the forecasting process of the transit revenues, including your focus and review of these efforts. So we've included a draft of the proposed 2017 annual report as attachment 1, and we also included the older report as attachment 2 for reference. So we're asking you to review and please discuss the draft annual report and provide any suggestions to us on the content and format of the report. And we'll bring back a revised version of the report to your June meeting for final approval. But alternately, you can take action now to approve the report at today's meeting as well, if you choose to take that action. So the final report will be scheduled for presentation at the June 23rd board meeting.
Your very opening statement, to maybe clarify things for me, you're saying that our obligation here and what we're doing is we're preparing and submitting a report to the board of directors.
Correct.
Not to the taxpayers.
It's both. It's the board of directors and for the public as well.
But it's kind of two different obligations. In theory, the board shouldn't be learning anything from us, but that they don't already know. But I would view our obligation as to being representatives of the taxpayers, apprise the taxpayers of what we think of the program they do. That is our responsibility.
Question on the information that's presented on page 9. And looking at the prior year report on page 8, the numbers are the same. Is that expected, or is that? So page 8 of the prior year report,
Page 8 is the prior, which is the maintenance of effort.
yeah, fiscal year 2015. And then page 9 of the current report, fiscal year 2016. Should I have expected to see those numbers change?
They're the same. They're different on mine.
So the deficit changed. So there's a deficit amount for one of the.
So the amount for streets and roads for all of the entities just remains steady every year?
It changes every 3 years. So I think what we're showing here is what the average of the return is, right? Obviously can't come from. Yeah, so
It's just a base amount every year.
Yeah. Yeah, so it does change every 3 years, so I have a little cheat sheet here. So this was FY 15, right, so in fiscal year 12, the MOE was re-indexed for fiscal years 15, 16, and 17.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe put that down.
Okay. You like our comments, I have one comment, please, on page 8 of this year's report. It's the next to last paragraph. All reporting agencies, with the exception of the cities of so-and-so, were not in compliance. Only those 4 were not in compliance.
Correct.
That paragraph left me hanging, quite frankly. The paragraph before it, we talk about somebody who's not in compliance, but they've agreed to correct it by the next year. And my only thought was, would you like to add a few, a sentence there that says something like, the non-compliant cities have agreed to correct this situation during the year ending June 2017. Something like that. It just left me hanging.
Yeah, and it is a little different. So the paragraph before the maintenance effort is a requirement of the ordinance.
Yes.
And there must be a correction to that in order for them to continue receiving their annual allocation as estimated.
Is there no requirement for the 30%?
Okay, so the difference is with the 30%, this 30% rule is in the Sandag board policy. And there is no annual requirement for them to correct it within a given time frame. What happens, according to the board policy, is that we do not pay them additional funds from their allocations that we're holding until they are in compliance. So there's a certification they must send to us, signed by the director of finance, that they're now in compliance with this, and then we can continue paying.
Would you like to make that as a statement?
Yeah, we can add something in there.
There will be no further payment until they reduce to
Absolutely.
that requirement. Something to give it some finality.
Okay.
Thank you.
Go ahead. Oh, sorry.
Well, I think I answered my question of previously on the last page we called it future ITOC activity, and now the new one is future activities. It's not exclusive to ITOC, it's the points related to the triangular board for the economic forecast. So at first I was thinking, oh, this isn't an ITOC activity, this is an overall activity, but I think we removed, I guess that everybody's comfortable with that.
Yeah, I thought that was written by Sandag, quite frankly. But that, I didn't see any reason
I think
to change it.
I think it's fine, as long as it's not stating that it's an ITOC activity, it's future overall.
That's, I mean, that's an interesting point. You're adding, this is sort of a new section here, right? So
Right.
it sort of doesn't, I mean, it's great because it lays out what's gonna happen here, and what I talk to be concerned about too. But it sort of doesn't really talk about what I talk's doing.
Reviewed and supported and then evolved or monitoring and reporting that out, not our activities.
Yeah, well, we did endorse it, but I understand.
No, and I think I'm not trying to, I'm just pointing out, I guess I'm just making sure we're all on the same page, but I think I'm okay with it, I think just as long as.
Unless you put down something like ITOC, just within the next year, ITOC will be looking.
Yeah, because
well, I mean, that's the only other way to do that.
That section is kind of like an ongoing and future, and then the upcoming triennial performance audit and the monitoring is kind of the same ongoing and future, but those two are related more to the ITOC. And then your involvement in that piece would be asking for the draft assumptions to come before the plan of finance came, and,
Bless
you
you.
know, you're receiving of that report.
You could put the two above that are ITAC related first, and then,
Okay.
I don't know, I'm just,
Yeah,
So is it the header that needs to be changed? Future activities / opportunities?
I don't know if it needs to be changed or not, I just, you know, there's typically, I think we've had, like you pointed out, the bottom couple of paragraphs are really ITAC specifically as activities versus that one we have a role in, but it's not our, completely our activity, so it's just a way to clarify the difference between those.
We can maybe
Well, I think if-
look at and frame it within the role that ITAC
Yes.
is taking
Yes.
to look at this.
Yeah.
And or require additional reporting or how it's gonna come back in terms of plan of finance updates or whatnot, and then I think that the background information maybe.
Yeah, I think it's good information.
Yeah, I think flipping it, just focusing in on ITAC's role in reviewing and providing
And we
oversight.
could also, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense, even if you didn't go that far, but I
Right.
concur with what you're saying. We could just even change this to speak with an ITAC voice, which is that, you know, ITAC was very concerned about, you know, the data integrity issues that have arisen and consulted with and concur with the recommendation to take the following steps. And I guess I would also not characterize this so much as revenue forecast, but, you know, kind of financial data or data integrity or other. But that's a good point. Thanks for bringing that up.
And then the one thing I think when your committee with regard to your triennial performance review, to the extent that you direct the performance auditors to look into areas of revenue forecasting or, you know, policies and procedures.
Yeah, and that's one thing that we've
yeah.
talked
Right,
about
right.
is that in light of, you know, some of the issues that have arisen and public comments and reactions, that we want to make sure that the performance audit is informed
Right.
by all of that. So that's.
Okay, Kai brought up a great point, quite frankly. I read that and I scratched my head. This is whether or not it's real or not, it is a significant political issue right now. It's still making the papers. I read just the other day about you're hiring a review agency, and I noticed that the lead man in the review agency was the biggest critic of the program, of what we were doing. So they basically hired the fellow who seems to know a lot about what we're doing. All right, so I looked at this particular paragraph, and I looked at the word supported. Now, frankly, I didn't understand a lot of what Ray was saying. He did a great job, and I understood the problem, but I'm not sure if I supported it. I support the idea that you're going to hire, or Sandag's going to engage the services of a review agency to review the situation. But I kind of scratched my head and thought, did we support the new data accuracy and modeling work plan? And I just questioned the use of that word. I think you'd like to have our support, and we certainly support what you're doing, but I didn't understand it. I did understand what you were doing, but I took it on as information. Is there any change in wording that we can say we support the idea of engaging the services to review the situation? Something like that. I'm trying to keep us completely clean and
Your minutes
Well,
from.
Yeah, the February meeting, we specifically endorsed the 7-point plan.
Did we endorse it?
You supported it. You definitely support the proposed work plan, and you had some suggestions for making it better as well, which we have shared and are actually documented in your minutes in this package from I think it was actually the March meeting. Suggesting, that as part of the continuous process improvement for mapping the modeling process and flow and explicit and regular review of the model itself. I think that was Chair Halpern's, be conducted on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, so, but to your point, Jonathan, maybe this language could be more specific to that 7-point plan, because, for example, we didn't endorse the selection of the person that they're speaking
But we
of,
endorsed
but
the
we
idea.
endorsed the 7-point plan that Ray had presented.
All right.
In that March meeting.
Something like that, and perhaps, I don't know if there's any difference between the word endorsed or supported.
Right. Did the 7-point plan go to board first and then ITOC? Did anyone ever take action on it, or was it always presented as information?
It's for the board to take action.
I think that's
But
fine.
the board had,
That board
and I can't remember,
requested.
it was the full board, right?
The full board
Yeah.
requested
So the
ITOC's
board
input.
requested ITOC
Yes.
feedback, and so we then had an extensive presentation and discussed it, and provided some feedback. I mean, I can't recall if we actually voted to.
Yeah, we did.
Did we vote?
So you reviewed and provided feedback.
It was,
to the
no vote, no vote, it was discussion, possible action, but you did discuss, and you supported and provided feedback.
Maybe we could just have this language track the minutes language?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Just make sure. Okay,
Sounds good.
thank you.
No problem.
I don't know if others have comments.
Can I raise maybe a much broader issue? I was encouraged to see on page 6, 2 pie charts. We had 2 pie charts last time, but they're completely different concepts we're trying to get across here. I think it's very encouraging to try to get to the reader that Transnet is just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. That the one piece Transnet and the one component of Transnet, a revenue forecast, got a whole bunch of attention. But if someone understands the overall equation, that one variable is overwhelmed by the multitude of other variables in that equation. I'm a little concerned that the bottom chart here, this is a very positive statement that we got 40% of the project done, 20% of the time passed. It doesn't really speak to the fact we borrowed a whole bunch of money to do that. It's the only way you could conceivably do that. And I'm wondering, particularly given the recent unfortunate publicity over the issues here, whether we as representatives of taxpayers ought to step back and try to put in front of those few of the citizens who are interested, but particularly the gadflies out there who want to try to muck around in things, a much better understanding of what this total package is. And my mind goes back to what were the voters promised, so to speak, if they would vote for the ordinance. There was an expectation that Transnet would generate Y dollars over 40 years. But there was also, I believe, an expectation that we would be able to achieve XYZ projects. I don't know to what extent there was any discussion to the voting public back then as this assumption includes the fact that we'd be able to leverage these Y dollars out of Transnet with a 3-to-1 factor from other sources. I don't know to what extent we can opine on what has really happened when someone who was tasked with coming up with engineering estimates within those scope definitions back then, and how that's evolved. Those probably, for example, is that anywhere near the original scope and dollar value that was originally estimated. But to do a status report, to me, this is the essence of a performance. You can do it every 5 years, every 10 years, but what's really transpired, and to try to educate the public of what they are getting for having voted for this. It's not as simple to say as the question I asked you earlier, is the revenue coming in anywhere near the expectation? And that's a small piece of the total equation. How bad have construction costs escalated or not escalated as rapidly as was assumed in those project estimates? Just do a one-time snapshot and put out a report to the taxpayers of what we, their representatives, think the program has produced.
And actually, to that point, the ordinance prescribes a review every 10 years. So we're actually approaching that time period where we'll be undertaking the 10-year review, looking back, what have we accomplished, not just the major corridors projects, but all of the programs within Transnet. So that's something,
I don't want to just focus on what we've accomplished, and we can put out all the pretty pictures of this and that. That's what folks want to see, but how did it work out? Where did the funds come from or not come from?
Right.
As I said, this is a start to explain to the general public that there's much more to this equation than just their transnet dollars.
Right.
In fact, the transnet dollars are only a quarter of the whole show. So we certainly ought to be talking more about the rest of the show, the 75% that's getting all these pictures created, than our 25% that's coming out of our taxes. So if it's coming in another year and the political follow all that's going on now can wait till then, that's fine. Otherwise, I would think maybe there's some value in us trying to address that as the ITALC, going back out to our constituents.
Yeah, I guess my reaction, I think, first of all, I think this is, I really applaud the sort of the fresh eyes that seem to be used to not just have this be kind of the same as we've done in the past, because this goes a long way, I think, in making more digestible and easy to understand for somebody who doesn't deal with this stuff day after day, you know, what some of the key issues and achievements are. So I think this is a huge improvement. I think we'd be remiss to not try to do as much as possible to address, as has been alluded to, you know, some of the kind of public discussions and concerns and things that are taking place. So I have maybe it's a little bit of a different view of on page 6, that I think that little bar chart on the bottom is pretty fabulous, because it speaks directly to one of the hot button questions of, you know, the whole notion of promises made, promises kept, which I think is a very powerful tagline. But then I think it's incumbent on us to, as much as possible, give the public the ability to make the assessment as to the promises kept part. The one thing that's missing, and I don't know if this is even really, you know, how feasible this is, but the one bar I would like to see on the bottom of page 6 would be, you know, a bar suggesting the extent to which we expect 100% of the projects to be completed by 2048 or not, because it's a great thing that we've got 40% of the projects that were initially discussed completed or underway. But if we're going to, you know, if we foresee dropping a bunch of projects, that's not a good thing. So just to reiterate that, if in fact the best estimate of what we're going to achieve going forward is just to reassert that all of the original projects promised are intended to be completed. And if not, we should just say, look, this is kind of where we are. Does that make sense to you guys?
But then you have to address the money, correct? I mean, because that's what you're talking about.
You'd have to, I would think then it begs the question as to why, you revise the list of projects relative to those promises. But again, to me, I think that promises made, promises kept is very powerful as a messaging item, but then it should guide the annual report to some degree. Or you know, and I think you've gone a long way in doing that.
I think that's a very meritorious thing. This is an excellent status. It's good news. What's the rest of the story? Is it the good news that we still expect, as difficult as it is to make those forecasts, that we'll do everything by the end of the day? And the other thing that I mentioned the word borrowings a few minutes ago is I predict 15 years from now, whoever's sitting here is going to be dealing with the criticism of the public. What do you mean the taxes now are not buying us any more pavement? It's just paying debt. That's going to come, and then can we precondition the taxpayers to the fact that the way we're able to do this is we're taking all those tax dollars from the future. They're not going to buy any new roads in the future. We're buying them now. People can argue whether it's a good thing or not, will those roads be worn out, so on and so forth, and you guys have your criteria for not buying short-term assets with debt, so on and so forth. So just precondition people, because the world will change 15 years from now. You'll be
even sooner.
You're not pouring concrete, you're paying debt. I think that'll be a big surprise that a vast majority of the taxpayers out there never had any interest, but until it hits the newspapers, they won't be interested once it hits the newspapers, and someone's got to explain that, oh yeah, it was a very conscious decision, and that's how you got this diagram. This didn't happen because people worked harder. someone went and borrowed money and enabled you to spend more than you had. But I don't think it's coming across to the public.
So I have a sort of a little bit of a nitpick point and then sort of a broader one. On page 7, I have to say, and maybe this is just the way my mind works, but anytime I see something like this, there's a part of me that wants to see that the math is working. So I just do the, City of San Diego 241 minus the 203 does not equal either the 40 or the 35.8, and I immediately then get confused because it's not, the footnotes don't clearly explain why to me. And so I may be the only person out of however many people ever look at this chart who thinks that way. But if the numbers don't add in that very simple way, I think we need to have a footnote that clearly explains why not.
I certainly assumed they did, and I eyeballed it. But
Yeah,
it's
when you
rounding,
eyeball it, it
and
looks
they're
like it's
close,
kind of close enough.
but they're not.
But it's not. And
It's
so,
counting accurate by any means.
again,
Poway's not accurate either, right above that line.
Relative to the number of people who will actually read this thing, compared to the staff time it'll take to change, it may not be worthwhile, but.
Yeah, but this comes off the report we see every month or something. I thought those numbers do tally. That third column is the difference between the first two columns in your original source document that we see.
And I don't know if this is the chart where the difference has to do with accrued interest or including it or not including it. But anyway, it's a real nitpick point.
Someone reads it.
I'm sure all of you guys immediately know the answer to this, so it's not that big of a deal to.
I do.
Okay.
So we can, it kind of is answered in the footnotes. So the first column, the cumulative actuals received, those are the allocations. That would just be transmit, sales tax. It's not going to include the interest earned. And the cumulative dispersed, good. Right, so those two may not match up exactly.
Right. So again, I don't dispute that there is a clearly understandable answer.
Yeah.
For me, I would just say that to the extent that the chart shows numbers that don't superficially just add,
right.
I just think we need to have a real clear explanation for this.
Yeah, and I think that we were trying to do that in footnote 1. Where we're calling out how the disbursements include other types of activity other than just the sales tax, but
you need to start off that explanation.
It's crystal clear.
Recognizing the numbers don't add, it's because
right, yeah. So we can work on
that.
We'll come up with something.
Yeah, there's no shame in literally saying the numbers may not add for this reason.
Right.
Yes, but you have to say that.
Yeah.
Yeah, say it.
Yeah.
Will not add for these reasons.
Well, yeah, in fact, will not add, yeah, so.
Because they don't.
See, I'm a good surrogate for the naive member of the public who doesn't really understand things very well. So, the only other thing I would just say is, to try to meet the time frame, if in fact we do want to have this, set and approved to be able to present to the board, I'm almost wondering if it would be helpful to have like a subcommittee to do an interim review before we get to our June meeting. Because otherwise I suspect we'll get to June, and this has happened the past couple of years where, to no fault of the staff, kind of 90% of what people ask for is in fact reflected 100% the way they wanted it, but there are always those few things that somebody says, well, maybe next year we could do this. And if we had an interim review step before the next meeting, we could kind of get it to 100%. Is that feasible, or?
Then you guys should do it, right? Because June is rapidly approaching.
Yeah, because if we just see a revised version in June, then we have kind of no time to do any further revision, so. And I volunteer, I don't know if anybody else would want to volunteer to be on a subcommittee, just to be a set of eyeballs. We don't necessarily have to have a physical meeting yet.
Yeah.
And I know for Brown Act purposes, we can only have 3 people.
Brad? The Stuart, Dustin, and Brad.
I was suggesting Dick.
Well, I can,
Just given his comments.
Dick,
Voted in, baby.
Dick, on page 6, I mean, there is, I mean, I hate to say it, there is some areas, you were talking about borrowing, and you want to get more specific, like some language in there, that, how they're coming up, is that the
I'd
area?
have to give some thought, I mean, people are probably more creative, but
No, but is that, so maybe you are making sense that, you're sort of.
This thing down here, if I'm the public and I'm really interested in this stuff, I say, well, how the hell did you do that? Jesus, we ought to have you running the city and all sorts of things, I mean, this is pretty good.
Well, that's a good point, just to footnote the fact that, well, it sort of speaks to the chart above, right, which shows that the transit money is leveraged from outside sources, including borrowing. But
I
to make it
don't know.
more specific, you're right, yeah.
Is the reason we were able to get 40% started or completed because we got so much more money from the outside sources than we were expecting in the original model?
You know, there's no single reason. Yes, we did borrow, and that certainly helped, but we also had significant infusions of one-time funds like Proposition 1B, stimulus funds, and so forth. That's on the revenue side. On the cost side, costs significantly dropped after the recession. So
this is what the public needs to
That's
know.
good.
Instead of worrying about some forecasting error, there's so many variables that
So it was a combination of all these things where we were able to, you know, use the dollars at hand, leverage funds, and, you know,
Good
significantly.
explanation right there.
Yeah, that's what I think would be very useful. I think it would benefit you guys to get the word out to the public. Not only how complex this model is, but where all the good news came from. Whereas a lot of these people folk around just want to focus on one little element of what they call bad news, that someone screwed up allegedly.
Kim Hudson.
And maybe not for this report, but maybe keeping in mind the next report as we bring, because there's going to be some significant changes with the next plan of finance, you know, with the TIFIA loan coming in from the codes that it up, reduces the cost of borrowing. What's yet to be seen with regards to whether Senate Bill 1, the state infrastructure bill, what that brings in terms of matching funds for the program. But a thought for the committee to consider is whether or not your report sort of boils down maybe some key points from the next plan of finance, which kind of distills that. Because from time to time, Dick, in terms of your question on, are we going to actually get to the end of the program and still do it? I mean, that's sort of the snapshot that we do every year to say, where are we? Are we on track? And from time to time, we've had a surplus. And granted, these are projections going out in terms of cost estimates and revenues, and where there's been a deficit, or where given a point in time, things look like you may not have full funding. So I don't know if that's an idea to consider for the next one, where you boil down and maybe do some key infographics that come out of the plan of finance.
I feel like we're hanging right now because there's been different things suggested. One, Stuart, you had mentioned that maybe a subcommittee so that people can review this before the June meeting. So is that an idea that you're thinking we should go forward with, or what do you think?
I mean, personally, I feel like that will enhance the ability to actually have an approved final for the June meeting. But then I think in the past you've said it's not a problem if we extend to July. So that would be the other alternative, is if we don't do that and we come to the June ITOC meeting and we want to have another iteration, we'd basically be pushing back our presentation to the Sandad board till July, which is, do we have a legislated limit on that, or?
The preference is that is the date, June.
Let's try to get our job done.
However, yeah,
let's
exactly.
do it.
And we can do
So
it.
do we need to then
We can
formally
definitely-
approve a subcommittee?
Yeah, you would.
Okay, so then, all right, so I'll move that we have a subcommittee
I
that
second.
we named individuals to.
And who's on it again? Just Stuart and Brad?
Why don't you have Dick?
And Dick? Okay.
I can pass.
Are they doing it?
I'll pass if Dick's on.
Yes.
You don't need to have three, you don't need
People
to have
are
three.
pointing the finger that you're the third, but
I have
you know.
one
Who's the
question.
second? I didn't get that.
Oh.
Oh, the three of us?
And so just from a Brown Act standpoint, that doesn't preclude us from receiving input from others, or does it, in terms of email communication?
It needs to stick to the three, right? Just the three.
Okay.
include Calvert, Barn, and Portland?
Correct.
Correct, okay.
So for example, if Tracy or anybody else
Tracy,
has
yes.
other.
Tracy, yes, because she's non-voting.
Oh,
That's
non-voting,
fine.
okay, because I'm.
She's not a voting member.
Well, we can get one-way emails, just not responding.
You can get a one-way.
Okay, so, sorry.
That's just to keep it to the three.
Yeah. Keep it to the three.
Yeah,
But,
let's repeat the motion for Sasso, but I also have a question before we close this item for Jonathan.
That's the three members, please, including the
Calvert,
motion.
Barnum, Portland.
So did anybody make a motion?
Yes, and I
I
second
made,
it.
I made a motion.
I second.
Any further discussion on the motion? Okay, all in favor? Thank you, Dick. I mean, you're sort of dragged.
So if
We don't
can
have to
come-
necessarily have a physical meeting, but. Okay.
And that vote whether I'm on this committee or not.
Veronica?
Jonathan, you had made a point, so we were talking about the ITAC review in support of the work plan, but you also mentioned that independent consultant that got hired by Sandag.
Disregard that.
Okay, because we don't talk
We
about
voted
that
to
in the
support
report?
it.
Okay, we don't talk about that piece of it in this report.
And that's fine, just disregard that comment and go with, as we left it.
We'll use the minutes and
Yes, that's fine.
rewrite that.
We did support it. We did pretty well, I understand.
Okay.
But again, thanks to the staff, because this is a big step forward, I think.
It's a lot of work.
Good job, yeah.
I don't know.
Okay, so, item number 15, early action program budget update. Susan?
Good morning. I'm Susan Huntington. I'm the Transnet Project Office Manager, and I'm here to present the FY18 Early Action Program Budget Update. So the Board of Directors will be asked to approve the proposed final budget at its May meeting on May 26th. And pending approval by the Board, the Early Action Program is growing by about $44 million, or 0.5%, for the total budget of $7.8 billion. During the annual update, schedules and budgets are updated, and they're attached to your report is a table which outlines all of the right sizing that's been done on the program budgets. And within your report itself, there's project-specific details for each of the projects that had an overall project budget update. So highlights of the early action program for FY18 include continued major construction on the Mid-Coast LRT project, with approximately $300 million anticipated in expenditures in FY18. This will be the largest cash flow for a single project in Sandag's history. So within the capital program, we anticipate to spend just under $900 million, and $300 million of that is anticipated on the Mid-Coast program. In addition to the major construction going on in the Mid-Coast program, on the I-5 North Coast to HOV lanes project kicked off in FY17, so we'll be continuing major construction there, including the replacement of the San Elijo Bridge. Also, major construction of double tracking along the Low Sand Corridor will continue, with significant progress being made on the Elvira de Marina double track project, the San Diego River Bridge project, and the San Elijo Lagoon double track projects. In addition, construction will begin on the Poinsettia Station improvements, and work will wrap up on the Oceanside Station pass-through tracks project.
Excuse me for interruption, but I make
Sure.
sure I'm tracking with what we're doing here.
Sure.
Because I thought I heard you focusing on cash flow for a year. Maybe I misunderstood. As distinct from, I thought you started with saying this is a update on the total budget at completion for these projects.
It is.
Whatever changes are written out.
I just wanted to make the point that on the Mid-Coast project that we anticipate just a massive year, major construction, lots of expenditures coming up in the next year.
Additional information, but the primary purpose here is what's the total aggregate budget
Yes.
you estimate?
Yes. Yep.
Thank you.
And then along with improvements to the I-5 and the double tracking of the railroad projects, significant work will begin on the major lagoon restorations. Over the next 5 to 7 years, increased EMP funding will be utilized to fund the necessary lagoon restoration projects. The proposed final budget also augments the budget for the South Bay Rapid project with $6 million in savings captured from the closeout of projects on other corridors. So this fully funds the current construction estimate, and the last segment is scheduled to advertise to bid in summer 2017. Service is expected to begin in spring 2019. And we also will continue to advance projects in the regional bikeway program. 2 projects will be going into construction in FY18, the Coastal Rail Trail San Diego Rose Creek project, and the Bayshore Bikeway 8B Main Street to Palomar project. 4 others will be in final design and are currently scheduled to advertise for construction in FY18. The Coastal Rail Trail Encinitas project, East Street to Chesterfield, Uptown Bikeways, 4th and 5th Avenue Bikeways, San Diego River Trail Carlton Oaks, and the Georgia Meade Bikeway project. So that concludes the highlights. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Just to help me put the numbers in overall perspective, the $7.8 billion we're talking about for the early actions. That is the total budget, which would include funding from all sources.
That's correct.
Not just Transnet.
That's correct.
Transnet is, if I can use the averages, is only a quarter of that in ballpark numbers. If you go back to the original Transnet ordinance, what portion of the original estimated Transnet dollars for the 40 years were going to be comprising the early action programs versus everything else that might generate over the years?
Overall, I think we anticipated spending half of Transnet dollars.
Roughly half of the dollars would be the early action, and then we'd have late actions that would evolve over time for
With
the
Transnet.
And do we have any rough feel for this $7.8 billion, the composition of that, was Transnet money and everything else, all the leveraging? How does that compare to what was originally assumed to how those early action things were going to get funded? Was we closely on the mark, or was
No, I think that
25-75, or is it?
Right, so if you look at the original assumption, program-wide, the assumption was that half the money would be from Transnet and half the money would be from some other source, whether it was state or federal funds.
Really?
That was the original assumption. So essentially a one-to-one match. So over time, we've been able to leverage more money coming in, but we also realized that we will need to continue to bring more money in from other sources, not just Transnet, to be able to complete the program.
Well, you said a mouthful there. That's very interesting. The original, we're talking ballparks here, was 1-to-1, and now we're achieving 3-to-1. That's huge. But you're saying you realize you're going to need to bring in yet even more.
Right. So
is that because the projects are turning out to be far more expensive than was originally envisioned? Why do you need?
Right. So I think, going back to the discussion that we had earlier, the amount of Transnet that was originally anticipated, so now we're anticipating less than that. Part of that is, less people in the region, as well as the recession itself.
But that decrement has got to be well overwhelmed by the fact it went from 1-to-1 to 3-to-1.
Right, and so that's on the revenue side, just looking at Transnet. Looking at the cost estimates, as we go into a project and learn more about the projects.
I'm well familiar with that.
Right, so we continue to refine those cost estimates, and in some instances, we find out that, projects are more costly.
The first thing you refine is the scope.
Well,
and then you do an estimate of the scope growth.
If I could also, is there a simple way to answer the question with regard to scope, that if you were to look at the original budget for the original projects as envisioned, what percentage of kind of currently estimated total increased cost of the life of the program relates to expanded scope? Is there a simple way to answer that, or even kind of a directional?
On ballparking.
Yeah.
I mean, you have the fact that costs might have gone up, sure, the unit cost might have gone higher or lower, but scope, I submit, is probably your biggest variance. And I don't think people have an appreciation for how you were supposed to, 10 years ago, estimate what a trolley going up the UTC was going to cost.
Again, if you put yourself in the shoes of the average taxpayer, when they see costs are expected to be dramatically higher, they see that really as a negative. But in fact, if you're expanding the scope, what you're really doing is you're enhancing what is being delivered to the taxpayer. And that may be, depending upon how much scope accounts for these changes, that may or may not be a material part of the messaging that would help clarify for people what's really going on.
so much depends on where the project was at the time of the ordinance in 2004.
Right.
For example, Route 52 there was a good handle on the cost of Route 52. Mid-Coast, as another mega project, take that as an example. Mid-Coast was on the ballot in 2002 based on 2004 based on $2002. The final preferred alignment wasn't even blessed by our board until 09, maybe? I'm trying to think. It was quite a few years later. The final environmental, which really blesses the alignment, was 2014. And so I can tell you that part of the alignment totally shifted the other side of the freeway. A lot of what was originally assumed could be at grade through UCSD is now elevated just because UCSD, the campus, has grown so incredibly that it has to be elevated. And so there was a lot of scope changes, just using Mid-Coast as an example. Other projects that were built immediately before immediately after the ordinance was passed, less so, because we had a better handle on what the scope of those projects were. There's also just, think about this, think of Mid-Coast. It's been 15 years since those projects were estimated, $2002. And just the regulation, just everything, the ability to work out on a freeway or on a train line, the window has just closed as more trains are operating, as more cars are on the road, and so your work windows are substantially shorter. Use Mid-Coast as another example. Our contractors working a 10-hour day and getting 7 hours worth of productive work because they have to stop every time a train comes by. That wasn't the case in 2004. There's a lot more requirements now as the urban area matures.
This is part of the message that the public needs a better understanding of. The variation in these issues far overwhelms the issue they're all fixated on now.
So there may not be an easy way to address that. It's interesting to have that added insight.
I think there is an easy way to.
Our doing as an agency is every time we do a regional transportation plan in RTP, we get better at estimating the cost of future jobs. We just put more and more effort into it to try to prevent this, to try to anticipate this.
One of the issues I would suggest you focus a bit on is you said it again, they're estimating the job. Estimating requires oversimplifying two things, scope and unit cost.
Right.
Apply to scope.
Right.
They're both difficult, but the scope overwhelms this one, at least in my experience. And you just gave us examples of that, but the general public doesn't begin to understand it.
Yeah, scope is very difficult when you have a maybe 5 or 6 page scoping document called project study reports compared to what you have to do years and years later to go out and build it. Very difficult.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Any other questions, discussion on item 15? So, Andre and Ray, we're going to give us a financial markets update.
So good morning. There's been no real changes in our debt profile since we last met in February. The only real changes are sales tax has increased by 3% through April. So that means that our debt service coverage has improved from 264 to 268. So 3% that we're currently at is a little bit higher than the revised number that we shared with you earlier at 262. The Federal Reserve did increase the short-term rates by 25 basis points back in March. That's the third increase they've had since they started raising rates for the first time in 10 years. And I suspect they'll have 2 more this year. The one thing that's done positive to our investments is that our short-term liquid funds that we have in the San Diego County pool and the California Asset Management Program, they're actually earning above 1% now, which may not seem like a lot of money, but for like 5 years we're stuck at about 40 basis points. So that's kind of helping our investments. We've talked about the TIFIA loan now over the last couple of years. The good news is that we're almost at the finish line. We are going through final loan document reviews. We will take the loan docs to the board the end of this month, so potentially the end of this month, maybe part of next month, we'll be closing on the loan, which is approximately $580 million, and this is mostly for the construction of the Mid-Coast project. And the reason why TIFIA as opposed to the bond financing is because it's cheaper. For example, the 30-year Treasury today is approximately 3%, so you get the rate of 30-year Treasury plus 1 basis point, so it would be 3.01%. It also has a lot of flexibility as far as when you can actually take it down and then you can pay it back. Ironically, we're also refinancing out of a TIFIA loan for our SR 125. When we initially purchased the toll road back 5 years ago, we inherited this TIFIA loan, which at the time rates were higher, so it was a little more, rates a little bit higher than today. The reason I'm bringing this to you is also we had a Transnet loan for $62 million. We're also going to be refinancing that portion of that loan. So that'll come back to the Transnet program, which will reprogram and spend on other projects. Additionally, what we'll be working on over the next couple of months, we have liquidity facilities. One of them is expiring. These liquidity facilities are for our variable rate program, $100 million that we have outstanding. In other words, if the remarketing agents are unable to remarket our bonds, they go back to the bank, so we have a liquidity facility for that. This one is with Mizuho Bank right now. We heard that the Japanese may be pulling out of the American market again, so we're not able to potentially review with them. We'll go out and do an RFP. Same thing with Union Bank. They are our providers for our commercial paper program. They're also coming due in September, so if we're not able to renew with them, we'll go and do an RFP for those as well. I just want to give you an update on the plan of finance, and maybe Jose, you can give a...
Yes. Before we get to that, if I can just ask a question in terms of, you mentioned a number of refinancing situations. You know, in light of the, you know, reduced revenue forecast, et cetera, I presume nobody's trying to be kind of cute and sort of save money in financing costs by changing the orientation to the maturity of how you would refinance the things that you were describing and try to, you know, save some interest costs by moving to much shorter maturities than you otherwise would do, just simply as a way of saving some money.
No, that's not it at all. With the TIFIA loan that we have, it's really an ascending loan. And so at some point we'd have to increase tolls by refinancing the TIFIA loans, which currently on our average are like 8.5%. We'll be refinancing down to today's level of 4%, and we'll be doing a level debt service. So the time will go out to the final maturity, which is the end of the franchise agreement, which is 2038, I believe. So the only thing that we're doing really is saving a ton of money. And the reason why we're doing this now as opposed to maybe a year or 2 years ago is because we had to show performance of the SR 125 toll road, and it's done very well. So it's been under Sandag for the last 5 years, and it's performing, so we can actually go out and tell a story to the bond market to attract investors to buy bonds. So all we're really doing is saving money, which is approximately $100 million in cash flow savings that we'll have by doing this financing.
So related to the TIFIA loan, as you may recall, we brought discussion of the assumptions that we would use for the plan of finance proposed to you back in March. And back then, the idea was that we would complete the plan of finance itself over the next, bring it back to you in April. We weren't quite ready to bring it to you in April, and then subsequent to that, two major things have happened. The first one, Andre touched upon, is we're almost there in terms of wrapping up the TIFIA loan, and that's one of the major assumptions, the interest rate that we assume for the TIFIA loan as part of the plan of finance. So we would like to use the actual interest rate that we will be locking in the TIFIA loan so that we can use that as an actual input, not just an assumed input. The assumed input is more conservative. And then the other one, and maybe more far-reaching into the future, is SB 1, Senate Bill 1, was passed and approved by the governor. And essentially what that does is it increases the gas tax, the diesel tax, additional vehicle license fees, and so forth. And this is every year, forever until the legislature, taxpayers change, or voters change it. So that is part of the revenues. There's a number of programs that SB1 contemplates. There's congestion relief, freight, active transportation, and so forth. One of the programs is the State Transportation Improvement Program, which is one of the matching funds that we use to match the transmit dollars. So we would like to hear back from the California Transportation Commission what they anticipate will be the near-term revenues, the next 5 years revenues, so we can input those as part of the plan of finance and have a much better near-term picture of the financial capacity of the program. So the CTC, California Transportation Commission, is scheduled to release their draft fund estimate at their June meeting. And so hopefully at that time we'll have that information plus the TIFIA loan interest rate that we can plug into the plan of finance and then run it and then bring it to you.
Jose, did you tell us last meeting that your expectation is this will be a net increment in funding, at least in the short term?
Yes.
There won't be an elimination of other programs, that this will just take its place.
Right. There is one exception. SB1 does sunset a program that was created back in the early 2000s. It's called a Traffic Congestion Relief Program. And its acronym is TCRP. The TCRP program is part of this SB1. And up until now, it was a program that was funded on an annual basis by the state, but there was no sunset to that program. But the amount of funds that was flowing into that program was insufficient for the CPC to complete all of the allocations that were.
But that's comprised some of the multiple that you just assumed was one
Right.
of the many different sources.
Right. So they're sunsetting that program, and so that would have an impact to us that we will also put into the plan.
Your assumption is the new legislation will bring yet more money in.
Correct. Yep. Yep. And then as time goes on, the CTC and probably State Transportation Agency at the state level will be developing the implementation guidelines for the other programs, the congestion relief, the freight, the rail programs, all of which we would be eligible to compete for. So as we know more, those would be incorporated in subsequent plans of finance.
Is your expected timing such that this would probably then come to us in the July meeting?
That's what we're shooting for.
Yeah. That you used just now, and in the past you mentioned the word compete. Is there a 2-minute explanation of the criteria for competition between us and the rest of the state?
Right.
So win these awards?
So the competitive aspects is what the CTC and the State Transportation Agency and perhaps other agencies will need to determine what the sort of the metrics would be. The sort of the past similar experience that we've all had in recent history is Proposition 1B, which included a congestion relief program and a freight program. And there were very specific criteria that were developed to be able to objectively measure sort of the value, the ranking of the projects that are submitted, throughout the state.
Were there really some in the past winners and losers, or did it just go through all this exercise to spread the money?
No, there were winners. We were actually very competitive in terms of having a wide variety of really good projects to compete.
That's a real function of how good your proposal is.
Yes.
Does it have anything to do with the fact that we have project-ready things on the shelf and other people don't?
If they use project readiness as a criterion, then yes.
One thing we were heartened by in the language to pass SB1, an example of a project that could be funded with the congestion relief portion was the Northwest Corridor project. That sort of model where we did this holistically looking at rail, highway, and community enhancements like that. So this specifically called out. And so we're hopeful that as the program guidelines get developed and stuff, definitely that would be a strong candidate.
That program being underway would be eligible for sorts of the new funds.
The Northwest Corridor would be eligible, yes.
Correct, right.
John?
We are very dependent on federal funding, support for our programs. Every so often I read that our new administration is threatening to reduce federal funding to sanctuary states because they're not complying with the federal regulations. Do you ever consider, are we pretty safe on that? We have contracts, I believe. Did you even think about that here at San Diego?
So, we consider that the funds will continue to flow to us.
Yes.
If things change, we'll continue to monitor. If things change, then we'll need to go back to our plan of finance and perhaps delete the funds for a year or something. Whatever the case may be. That's what the plan of finance exercise is for, so that we can put in the latest information that we have, whether it's costs or revenues or whatever, and then bring back options in terms of accelerating or slowing down.
Jonathan, I thought, from what I've read, the only funds that are in question are the ones sourced out of Homeland Security, not government.
He talks in generalities. I'm not trying to get political, but and I heard that courts say that this is illegal, so we're probably protected. I was just wondering if Sandag even thinks about that, but that's fine.
Think about it at 2 in the morning.
Then you get on and you look at what the latest tweet is, right? So you can find out.
I don't think it'll happen. I don't think it'll be allowed to happen, but just asking.
So, yeah, I think Ray's going to talk about our economy now.
I like to start with like the world view always, and I think the world's kind of entered a period of more uncertainty than we've had before, especially with what's going on in North Korea and with Russia and the way that we're dealing with those things. And also, when we take a look at Europe and you're looking at some of these countries that are potentially exiting the European Union, all of these things eventually, or in some ways, if they go south, would impact our local economy. But overall, right now, what's happening is that the global economy has actually kind of ticked up a little bit. So the conference board projects that there's going to be about 2.9% growth next year globally, which is a little bit higher than it was before. So that actually comes out as a relatively good thing for us. But it's interesting that you bring up the infrastructure as or the current administration as a concern, because one of the things as we go down into the nation that I look at is what are all these policies that the federal government is pursuing that possibly would impact our economy. And just in the last 100 days, I mean, the things that we've heard are things like personal tax cuts and corporate tax cuts. Both of those would have potentially a positive a positive effect on the region if it happened. There's always a negative too, and the thing with a lot of the Trump policies is that there's no agreement in terms of what it looks like on the other side. But there's also the repatriation of trillions of dollars that could come back into the country. A lot of that would end up in California. That could be good for our economy too. Infrastructure programs, $1 trillion in spending. Some of that would trickle our way. That would also be good. And a lot of these, if you look at, these are all really fiscal stimulus. Most of what he's proposing are fiscal stimulus plans. Defense spending would be another thing that would potentially help the San Diego economy because of our military presence here, in both support of the military and also military being positioned here in San Diego. And that goes to the buildup of the military. With the West Coast pivot continuing to happen, the military brings more ships over here. We end up with a larger military base, which is relatively stable. It's good for our economy. Then you look at things like repealing or modifying the Obamacare. I mean, currently everyone knows what the status is there. It was passed in the House, it's now in the Senate. Don't know what kind of overall impact that would have on our local economy, but it will have some. Relaxing regulations, trade, immigration, all of those things would have some type of effect on our local economy. So those are the type of things that I look at the U.S. economy. And with that said, none of this has really happened yet. This is all what has been talked about in the last 100 days. But the result of all of that talk is that we have Dow 21,000. Over 500,000 jobs were created in the U.S. in the first quarter of this year, another 211,000 just in April. So there's building consumer confidence nationally that the economy is going to get better. Unemployment rates at the national level have fallen to 4.4%, which is almost full employment. We talk about underemployment, I think, at some of these iTalks, and so I've pulled some of those figures. Underemployment for economic reasons, or people not being employed fully, has also declined by 281,000 down to 5.3 million nationally. So that unemployment rate is falling, as are the discouraged workers, who are the ones who didn't enter the workforce because they didn't believe they could get a job. Those numbers fell 113,000 year over year to 455,000 nationally. So all the unemployment rates seem to be coming down. Those are all relatively good signs for the San Diego economy. When we look locally at what's happening, we have non-farm employment up 2.1% year over year to 1.433 million, which gives us an unemployment rate lower than the nation. It's about 4.2% here in March. We've gone through over 5 years of expansion and continue to expand. That's somewhat concerning, only in the sense that the economy likes to take breathers every once in a while. So we're pushing out a recession. I just don't know how far we're doing that. Inflation is low. And that's not necessarily good for our tax receipts, because the reason that it's low here regionally is the decrease in energy prices. Energy prices are down 7.7% year over year, and the bulk or one of the major components of our sales tax is fuel prices. And as fuel prices come down, so do our taxable sales. But you look at the San Diego housing economy, multifamily permits still out, or building still outpaces single family. The volumes, though, are not that much significantly greater this year than they were last year. And the forecasts are that for 2017, that about 42,000 housing units would be sold, which is about the same as preceding 2 years, with the peak being in 2003, right before the bubble. But housing prices continue to go up. If you look at Realtor.com, for instance, they're looking at the average list price in San Diego of $625,000 now for the average list price of a house, or a house listed right now. Zillow has it right under $600,000 at 595%. That's up 5.2% this year. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that mortgage rates are still low. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that
Is house defined as basically any dwelling, so it includes single-family houses as well as?
These would be single-family homes. Specifically. Mortgage interest rates are low, and that's really, in large part, what's fueling the real estate market. If interest rates start to creep up, then I think what you're going to see is the housing market start to soften, because the affordability index will continue to fall, and people just won't be able to afford the houses. But when you take a look at overall what's going on, there seems to be this increase in business confidence, and I think you can feel that locally as well as nationally. There's continued decline in unemployment, meaning more people spending money in the economy, more jobs, labor force continues to increase, and even wages are starting to increase a little bit. So with all of that said, I believe that taxable retail sales could be expected to pick up a little bit in the next year as consumer confidence continues to increase in the economy. And with that, that's the conclusion of my report.
We like it this time.
You like it?
Right, you said something that was interesting. It should be obvious when you think about it. Mentioning it forces you to think about it. But the public will be very enamored with the fact that gasoline goes from $4 a gallon down to $2.50.
Right.
And you're saying that represents a very big cause for a decline, or a shortfall in the estimate of our sales tax revenue.
Well, it does. So the biggest components that we have of our sales tax revenue are the fuel, new car sales,
Is there a way to ballpark the percentage of total that fuel represents?
Yeah.
Ballpark.
I don't know off the top of my head.
Again, it's back to the public's education of what's going on, and we're worrying about errors in forecasting when you have an uncontrollable variable with the price of fuel, which people celebrate the reduction of fuel. It gives rise to a shortfall.
Yeah, I had that number too. I should have brought it with me. I had the entire table with me. I'm sorry. But yeah, so and retail sales are soft too. And as things move to the internet, we lose sales tax revenue because not all of the things that are purchased through Amazon are taxed. And that's a very significant part of our sales tax revenue. Another big one is food services. So as the economy increases, or people are confident to go out to eat more. So we've got that component too for the sales tax. But overall, you're right. The fuel prices are large, and therefore.
But you just came up with the second one, the internet. Those are two things that every taxpayer can very readily relate to and appreciate that. Oh, I like my no gas taxes, and I sure like Amazon, but I pay a price that I'm not aware of, and it's in chance that's getting less money than was originally estimated, and it wasn't an error in that estimate.
But and that's part of the difficulty in estimating the sales taxes is that is that we need to look at each one of these components separately to see what's happening with that. So.
You can't foresee these things 40 years out in the future. What's the matter?
Knowing how retail is going to be, 20, 30 years from now would be very interesting. But,
you mentioned something that hadn't impacted me on before, but the issue of trying to change the federal tax rates or something to encourage repatriation of offshore profits. No one ever talks about the state doing their part in changing their tax rates. So if that was to happen, you mentioned a large chunk of this with all the Silicon Valley money and everything, that could have a major impact on the state's fiscal situation.
Except they'll go to Nevada. They won't come to California. They have to pay taxes here.
It depends where they're going.
And it depends how they reinvest it. I mean, if a lot of that money comes from, just think of how much money Apple has offshore. I mean, if they bring it in, it would have some type of impact here in California. But you're absolutely right. There's a lot of this is at the state level.
Yeah, the feds are going to cut them a deal, but the states will reap a windfall from it.
But it is a very interesting economic event to watch, to see what would happen if you open the floodgates and allow all this money to come back, to see exactly how it actually works.
Allow or require?
Excuse me?
Allow it to come back or require it to come back?
No, allow, because.
I know, but well.
Encouraged. It'll be encouraged.
Yes, it'll be encouraged. Yes.
I have a couple of questions. One is put aside the handicapping of whether it would ever actually get approved or not. The notion of not being allowed to deduct state taxes on your federal income taxes obviously California would be probably the most impacted state. But has anybody done any analysis as to if that were in fact passed, that would have noticeable or material impact on the local economy and consumer spending, or is it just so speculative nobody's even bothered to?
I haven't seen any reports to that effect, but I will keep my eye open for one, because I'm sure someone will do one, but I haven't seen anything.
That's probably unlikely. But then the other thing I was kind of curious about, Ray, you started off by mentioning that the times were very uncertain from a political standpoint, North Korea and a variety of other things. I'm curious, both you and Andre, in terms of what you hear when you're talking to others. It doesn't seem as if that uncertainty is really being reflected in the markets, right? Oftentimes when there is, scary stuff out there, people will tend to be more conservative, and you'll see a reaction by the markets. It just doesn't seem to be happening. Is there anybody have a reason as to why the market seems to be shrugging off the variety of really scary things out there in the world?
And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that there is so much of it going on that we're almost immune to the news that for instance, we could start a nuclear war with North Korea, right? That's a real possibility, but people don't react to these possibilities because there's so many things that are going on. If you take a look at the immigration that occurred into Europe, or you look at terrorism, to me there are these massive things that I don't think people can wrap their heads around how much of an impact it could have if something happens. So it's more like wait and see until it does happen, and so you end up discounting the entire event until something happens. When I bring it up as an issue, it's like keep it out there and watch it, because if something does happen with North Korea, then there will be an impact. right? But I don't think of this as really baked in at this point.
Yeah, I don't know, I guess, and Andre, you know, talking to people that you probably talk to, I guess I always thought the markets are supposed to be anticipatory as opposed to some degree at least, and I could be wrong, but I suspect that, you know, going back to the Nixon days when the markets opened after the Saturday Night Massacre, there was actually some reaction in the market. It just seems like we just don't see any reaction in the market to these things. It's curious.
It's an interesting comment you make, because just yesterday, the Goldman Sachs CEO came out and said the one thing that concerns him in the market is the lack of volatility. So the observation that you make is something that the Goldman Sachs is seeing as well. It's kind of strange for, you know, markets have been relatively flat, if you will. I mean, they went up and they've basically been relatively flat for all the news that's been happening. It's exactly the comment that you made. It's very unusual. You expect to see a lot more movement than what you have seen.
Well, I guess if he's confounded that, I don't feel so bad as you.
I think it largely is a question of the opportunity cost. The search for yield doesn't allow you to go anyplace else. It's paying such a price to walk away.
And by the way, just to give that number as far as our retail sales, what they're comprised of, the department stores and miscellaneous retail is 18%, followed by restaurants at 14%, then auto sales at 10%, and the next big number is our the gas, which is at 6%.
Any other questions? Well, thank you guys, appreciate it. Thank you. So, Caroline had raised a question earlier for Kim about the update on.
Kim, could you please give us a very short update on AB 805 and how it will impact Sandag's way of doing business, if at all?
Okay, so AB 805, Assembly Bill 805 was introduced this session by Assemblywoman Rowena Gonzalez-Fletcher. I think it was back in the February timeframe. It's been amended a couple of times. There's other amendments that are expected to come out in print in the next day or so. There's provisions in there for governance changes, both to the Metropolitan Transit System Board of Directors as well as the Sandag Board of Directors, and some taxi authority changes. So just briefly on the transit side, it would change the governance, the makeup, and then the leadership of the governance of the board. This is the Board of Directors for MTS. And give both MTS and NCT to the authority to do sales tax revenue measures for public transit purposes in their respective areas. And those are, and public transit is including transport. You think about rail, trolley, bus, but as well as bicycle and pedestrian improvements. On the Sandag side, provisions are probably primarily two areas: governance and sort of auditing and transparency provisions. So on the governance side, it would institute as some permanent leadership at Sandag the mayors of the two largest cities. So in this case, it'd be the city of San Diego and Chula Vista, and they would be alternating as the chair and vice chair for 4-year terms in perpetuity. It also would change the voting structure of the board, where currently, except for the consent calendar, relies only on the tally vote. So one member, one vote for each jurisdiction. So all other actions of the Board of Directors requires the simultaneous weighted and tally vote. So for each of the 19 jurisdictions, the 18 cities in the county, each jurisdiction has one tally vote, and each jurisdiction also has a weighted vote, which is really based on their population. What AB 805 would do in terms of that is get rid of the tally vote and really require it to be only on a weighted vote. And so the concern there is that with the city of San Diego currently at 40%, with Chula Vista at 8%, that those two cities plus potentially one or two jurisdictions could have say over all actions that Sandag does, not just transit, but anything the agency does. So that's a definite concern about the board members. Our board has voted at their last meeting to oppose the bill unless amended. It was the position to oppose it was, out of the 19 jurisdictions, it was 16 of them voted to oppose the bill, 2 of them abstained, and 1, wanted to originally or support the bill, and that one was Chula Vista. The 2 folks that abstained were Imperial Beach and Encinitas. So the board members have been going up. There's been 2 committee hearings. The Assembly Local Government Committee and the Assembly Transportation Committee have both heard the measure. It has passed out of those 2 committees, largely on partisan lines. It's going next to the Appropriations Committee on May 17th, where Assemblymember Rona Gonzalez is actually the chair of that committee. We fully expect the bill to actually make it through and actually pass out of its House of Origin. It's just typically how it's done. And then we're working with our delegation and board members on potential amendments. So I talk a lot about the governance side, which is what really sort of is bristling I'd say our board members. On the auditing transparency side, there's some provisions, for example, creating a new policy advisory committee at SANDAG. So we currently have the Transportation Committee, Regional Planning, Borders, Executive Committee, and the Public Safety Committee. We create a new audit policy advisory committee made up of 2 board members and 3 members of the public selected by the board. It also would require the hiring of and whether it's a consultant or it's an employee, an independent auditor at SANDAG that would have certain powers and could only be terminated for cause and would be, fills, I think, be hired for 5-year terms or something like that, and require certain things. So some of the dialogue we've been having, our board just did have its first conversation with staff from Assemblymember Gonzalez Fletcher's office this past week or so, to share on the audit side. While the board is fully committed to auditing transparency, it's just sort of what's written in the bill is really not reflective of the situation here. So they were surprised to learn that we do in fact do audits, annual CAPers, that we actually have a performance auditor, that several performance audits, both internally. We employ an internal management auditor that does internal audits to improve processes, and it's a management tool. That the ITOC itself has performance audits that it does, and these fiscal and compliance audits. So that was a little bit of an education there with them, where they basically took language directly from sort of an association of governmental auditors or something, and had kind of just lifted language out of sort of City of San Diego, their model, without respect to understanding what types of oversight activities go on here. In talking with their staff, if they're really looking on, they figured if they threw more auditing, that they feel that they would have found this mistake, the error in the models, which I think we would disagree with, that the actual mistake would not have been found by an auditor, but auditors, like performance auditors, could have working processes in place, right? So these things that we're doing now with the data accuracy modeling work plan. So there's some education there, and I think there's possibly room, depending how willing the assembly member is to sort of work on amendments in terms of clarifying that. We did speak a lot about the ITOC and the existence of the ITOC and the kinds of audits that the ITOC does. And so I think there's some good education and discussion going forward. I see that's an area I see where there's room for compromise. The board is supportive of it, but also does not want to create additional bureaucracy, additional costs to taxpayers by putting in, conflicting and duplicate things. So that's where it is right now. We put the SANDAG's formal position as opposed unless amended, but we do expect, like I said, some movement. We expect to get out of the assembly and have some movement on the Senate side in terms of potential amendments.
Thank you.
Potential amendments.
I appreciate that.
And any reaction from the governor?
No, we haven't really reached out at that level yet.
Because you have no idea how he would feel about it.
No, I mean, the only measures we have kind of prior in terms of locally within San Diego is if the prior legislative session, the assembly member wanted to make some governance changes to Civic, which is sort of the successor agency, the redevelopment agency within San Diego. That made it all the way out through the legislature. The governor did veto that. We are also not the only ones in terms of in the state having legislation aimed at governance. LA Metro is experiencing something similar with the bill aimed at changing sort of their governance model. And I think, you know, in terms of, well, there was not sort of an error, it does come from, I think, well, they had a successful sales tax measure. It's still contentious. There was, you know, you don't please it 100%. So I think these bills come from.
You mentioned voting along sort of party lines. I guess I'm not sure I see on a conceptual basis how this relates to, you know, political party philosophies. The party line comment, is it just that because it's proposed by a Democrat, Republicans are going to vote against it, or is there actually some issues-oriented aspect to this that relates to party philosophies that I'm not seeing?
Don't answer it.
Yeah, I don't think there's. I just made it as a comment, and actually on the first committee, one of the Democrats did vote to oppose, so it wasn't entirely. But the last committee, the Transportation Committee, was purely on party lines. I mean, I think that the discussion and the understanding was folks are willing to kind of give leeway to their fellow members, and because the process, the legislative process is long, right? It's only in its initial house, so, and with the understanding that there's still dialogue going on and there's still room to sort of influence the actual language of the bill. So I think there's deference paid to members.
She's chair.
No, that
she's chair of appropriations. Everybody's got to go through it. I mean, they're going to.
Stuart, the chair and vice chair of the two largest cities too. If you mentioned that, we'll rotate vice chair and chair, and that's the city of San Diego and the city of Chula Vista.
Yeah. Right.
The liberal. I mean, basically, those cities are going to be more of a liberal vote in general because they're large cities. So I think this is aimed at a lot of the conservative versus labor versus liberal issues as well. Who's going to get the whole same bag? This is more of a, so you're hearing a power play issue as well, in addition to disenfranchising smaller cities. This is going to
Kim,
be.
as it relates to TransAct, possibly our responsibility, was there anything in the ordinance that was tied into the voting structure of Sandag that would dictate how the transit money would be spent? In other words, if I'm one of the small cities, when I approved my taxes going into this big pot, did I have some comfort that there would be a voting mechanism in Sandag that would represent my interest, or would it be under Gonzalez's effort? I'm just lost. I have no voice at all.
Not explicitly the Sandag voting structure. With regard to sort of the ordinance itself, there are certain provisions in the ordinance that would require, if there's, the ordinance does foresee that there could be potential changes or amendments to the ordinance, right? And so, for example, when Andre mentioned the TIFIA loan that we were seeking to actually take out or pay off, the board went through the ITOC, and the board also, you know, authorized a $60 million loan from Transnet to acquire the South Bay Expressway, the state of 150. So from time to time, amendments are made. The ordinance, any amendments do require a 2/3 vote, if not of the people. There's certain things which lock box that way that would require the vote of the people, but do require 2/3 vote of the board. So in that respect, that's the only thing that really gets into.
It's a different issue. Here's the voters affirmatively approved taxing themselves for a specific purpose. Right. And implicit in that was there was a governance structure that would determine how that money would be spread around the different geographical elements of the region. And here is someone from left field coming kind of superimposed state legislation that would overwhelm that.
And it certainly could, if I'm understanding right, that certainly could flip the balance of, you know, in terms of at least priorities in the spending, because, you know, you could, in theory, you know, if the way it currently operates in the voting structure, you know, regional thinking and everybody's got a say versus, okay, we want to prioritize transit in the urban core and not, and exclude those votes of the regional thing, and it change the priority. And that's the
intent
whole
of the legislation.
Well, sure, I mean,
To me, it's profound. That's why I was wondering whether there was any original premise in the ordinance which mandated broad representation to control that particular.
Well, that's the two-thirds vote of the board.
Yeah, but now
Two-thirds
two-thirds would be
vote of the board.
cinchy, right, with weighted votes?
If you got a state, then it becomes a constitutional issue, whether the state has a right to come in after the fact to change the premise under which an ordinance, or the local ordinance was passed.
But I'm sure you guys are bringing this up, right?
Yeah, we're looking at different
Okay.
Okay, since we're already a little bit past noon, unless there are further items to discuss relating to that.
Are we gonna see Carolyn one more time?
Well, before that, yeah, I was gonna say, so June 14th is our next proposed meeting. I don't know if people know they have conflicts, but I was gonna otherwise make a motion that we thank Carolyn for her service and her expertise and making it a pleasure to come to these meetings, knowing that we'd have her insight and good cheer. So I propose that we formally thank Caroline for her service.
Second.
I think that's wonderful, and we also invite her to come back to every meeting. She can make public comments, all that she wants.
We'll have a seat for you right there.
That's right.
Can I have a few minutes to say?
We have to vote.
Oh, shoot.
Does this relate to the item proposed?
Well, we have to have her back because she started a tradition where she's brought pie for every person that has left. And so
I brought pie today.
Yes. You did?
Yeah, I did.
You're not supposed to bring pie for yourself.
No, but, okay, here's what I said. If you're from Caltrans, and you can attest to this, if you have a birthday or anything important, the rule is you bring treats for everyone. In other words, people don't have to worry about your birthday, they only have to worry about their very own. So I'm trained in Mud Stoller, remember? He brought his homemade cake all the time, so
Well,
that's the way we
all
do
in
it.
favor of letting the record formally reflect our thanks for Carolyn for her service.
You can vote.
Okay, I want to just have a few seconds because there's certain memories you have when you've been working closely with people. And I'm going to start with Tracy. Tracy, your abacus kind of mind has always impressed me, and I've appreciated all the skills that you have used when you volunteer for committees. I know you're not really volunteered, you have to do it, but we really appreciate, we really appreciate the fact that you really can cut right through all the chaff and then tell us what's important with your great auditor skills. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, Kai.
Oh, here we go. Go down the list here? Oh,
Yeah,
boy.
Kai, I always associate you with bread. And the reason that I do it, no, because think about it. He is a person who designs projects, and then you're the guy that has to construct it. And when anybody who's ever been involved with project construction knows that you guys really have to be like this, because if he doesn't design it well, there's no way in heck that you can build it. So I appreciate that same kind of information that you share in your real jobs when you come to the table here and help us understand things that we have to vote on. So thank you. Next, Dustin, I just wish to heck I could be here for you this coming year, because I think you're going to do a great job. And although you're not known as a voracious talker, I know that you think. So I think you're going to have a great year. Okay, Jonathan, I will always think of you whenever I see the city of San Diego displayed. Because you have really made it your mission, and you have done a great job of not only making sure that the city of San Diego started a dialogue with us, but then they come each year and you're on them for finding out if they really have followed through on their promises. So that was great. That was very good.
You're going to be on her mind a lot.
Okay, now what can I say about these two brains over here, which are you and Stuart, are the kind
Is that a
of...
ball delusion?
No, it is. If I had the ability to do a partial brain transplant, I would want to take your brains and put them in here, because you have this ability to see what all these things mean. When people talk about TIFIA loans and, you know, weighting the interest on one side versus another, you can cut right through that, and you make it actually understandable to a person like myself. So I'm going to end with saying, who is the greatest in this room? It's got to be all you staff members that work so hard to make sure that we have something put in front of us that is legible, understandable, and you teach us, and you do it very patiently, even though we may ask the same questions over and over. So thank you all for a great experience. And we do have apple pie. 8 years.
8 years.
And I'm still living.
Oh, so I guess we are, do we have to eat the pie before we can adjourn? Or post-adjourn?
Wait, didn't your mom ever tell you that the real rule is you should eat dessert